Chapter 202 Silence. Chapter 202 Silence. Just as Han Li ordered the 7 children blades to intercept the silver sword, he soon immediately felt his opponent's strength. With only this single huge sword magic tool, the large man immediately and unwaveringly pushed down on all of the golden blades. The 7 golden streaks formed a defensive golden net. Under the tyrannical collision against the huge silver sword, the golden blades were completely defeated and weren't even able to suppress it in the slightest. Instead, the golden blade's radiance rapidly grew dim from the silver sword streak's strike, a clear sign that the golden blades were breaking down. It seemed to be only a matter of time before they would be destroyed, much like the young woman's handkerchief. However, Han Li had yet to experience the might of the silver sword and was surprised. In accordance to might, his gold beetle swarm blades were only common trash among top-grade magic tools. Being no match against the silver sword was within expectations and nothing to make a fuss over. As a result, Han Li pointed his finger, wanting 2 of the golden blades in the struggle to shoot toward the large man. He wanted to first test the opponent's defensive methods. Besides, he wanted to see whether this was an opportunity he could exploit. After all, if someone were dead, there would be no point in how strong someone's magic tools were. 2 of the golden streaks Han Li was controlling were just about to turn, wanting to fly toward the man's legs. Unexpectedly, the opponent's huge sword suddenly resonated with silver light, and with the sword hilt at the center, it rapidly whirled. In an instant it turned into a huge silver disc and released countless threads of attractive force from its center, causing the nearby golden blades to become incapable of moving in the slightest, as if they were weighed down by 1,000 kilograms. The 2 blades, wanting to leave naturally, weren't able to luckily escape. These scenes caused Han Li to be stunned from alarm. As soon as he regained his senses, he hastily looked toward the large man. As expected, the opponent was using a strange magic technique. His hands were dancing with the wind as if he were gesturing some sort of circles. Han Li didn't give it much thought and promptly patted his storage pouch. A flying blue dagger and a gold alms bowl flew out. The 2 items didn't stop at Han Li's side and shot straight toward the large man. Although the hands of the barefoot man from the giant sword sect were not idle, Han Li's actions were clear. He sneered for a moment. Then he suddenly changed the incantation gestures in his hands and held his bare hand against the flying dagger and alms bow, pointing at the 2 objects from a distance. Han Li immediately felt the result. He lost his connection to the 2 magic tools that were originally in their control. Whoosh! Whoosh! The 2 magic tools actually flew over 20 meters away and were sucked in by the floating huge sword's silver vortex. Pooh! Pooh! Just as the 2 high-grade magic tools were about to enter the huge silver sword's rapid vortex, they were unable to endure for that short moment and burst into fragments like fireworks. Those sparking magic tool fragments made an exceptionally beautiful meteor shower. Han Li's mouth was currently dry. He completely did not expect the opponent's cultivation and silver sword to be this great. Not only were his golden beetle swarm blades trapped, his 2 high-grade magic tools were disposed of, thoroughly destroyed without the slightest of effect. This truly caused him to become apprehensive. Bang! The sound of the explosion greatly frightened Han Li. His complexion rapidly paled as he looked over to the source of the sound. As expected, the original 7 of the golden swarm blades turned to 6 with a beautiful golden rain of sparks appearing from the center of the silver vortex. Under the large man's control, the silver vortex was actually starting to destroy and absorb the golden blades. When it had only started to destroy high-grade magic tools, Han Li would only be apprehensive. But now that the golden blades started to disappear, Han Li truly felt some heartache. These were top-grade magic tools. Furthermore, because they were a complementary set, each loss would significantly reduce its power. With his extreme heartache, Han Li no longer hesitated and flipped his right hand, taking out the small mirror from the girl with many treasures. Han Li hurriedly poured spiritual power into the mirror and then pointed it to the sky, immediately spouting out a brilliant azure mist from the mirror. The mist immediately returned the huge silver sword vortex to its original appearance. It trapped the silver sword and the remaining golden blades in the azure light, causing them to become completely motionless in midair. The barefooted man's completely complacent expression immediately disappeared without a trace when he saw Han Li's small mirror. With a pale expression, he loudly cried out, "The azure stasis mirror! How did you acquire this item? Isn't that the life-saving magic tool of the masked moon sect's Xianxia? Could it be that you killed her?" After the large man said this, he looked at Han Li with an incredulous gaze, as if he had done some sort of treasonous action in defiance of the natural order. This caused Han Li to feel a moment of unrest. From the opponent's tone of voice, it seemed as if this top-grade magic tool was able to cause him a great amount of inconvenience. Han Li could not help but stop his hand for the time being, wanting to hear what the opponent had to say. What's the idea? I didn't kill her. I received it from the one who killed her, from the hands of that guy called Feng Yue. Could it be that there's something strange? Han Li wrinkled his brow, saying this with an unsightly expression. These words of your esteemed self, would the martial ancestor of Masking Moon Xianxia believe them? Will a core formation expert or a Masking Moon sect elder believe the mere trifling words of a Qi condensation disciple? The large barefooted man said with a sneer, coldly laughing several times. Han Li's heart suddenly sunk. He knew that if what he had said was true, then he would have no chance to explain himself. He hadn't the slightest evidence to exonerate himself and prevent himself from dying. Instead, he had that malicious woman's magic tool in his possession. As it was, that masked moon sect elder would most likely not let a murderer like him get away. This is far too troublesome. When he thought that a core formation expert would take note of his small life, not only did Han Li's mouth grow painfully bitter and dry, but he also felt gloomy to the point of wanting to spit out blood. With this said, he was being treated extremely unjustly. Not only did he not kill her, but he also killed Feng Yue, which could be considered revenge on her behalf. But now the result was a core formation expert pursuing him while he had no method to prove himself innocent. After all, how could a person who could kill a Qi condensation disciple with her fingers like it was no different from squashing an ant ever possibly listen to him? His own elders of Yellow Maple Valley would mostly likely not act on behalf of a nobody such as him and offend an elder of the masked moon sect. The more Han Li thought, the more he felt that what his future held was anything but good. Could it be that, after he left the forbidden area, he would have to travel far away and flee death by living with a concealed identity in another country? Han Li truly did not want to take that path. The large man clearly saw Han Li's gloomy expression and could not help but laugh heartily, rejoicing in his misfortune. As the barefooted man's laughs grew louder, Han Li's expression grew increasingly darker. A timid voice came from the side. Let's all keep it a secret and not tell anyone else. Is that fine? The young green-clothed woman, who listened clearly formed the side, interrupting with some hesitation. Keep it a secret. Han Li and the large man were startled, unable to keep their emotions in check. Then they looked at each other with a strange expression and suddenly shut their mouth, keeping silent. The words that the young woman had wanted to say caused the two who were baffled to immediately swallow in fear. With open pupils, their eyes could only spin around incessantly. They didn't dare to speak. During the silence, Han Li suddenly put his hands behind his back and slowly paced back and forth nearby. Meanwhile, the large man was rigidly staring at Han Li's every movement with an extremely solemn appearance. In this peacefulness that caused people's heartbeat to slowly accelerate, after the time it took to make a cup of tea, the large man with a solemn expression opened his mouth and broke the silence. I truly did not think of that. Us two were actually reminded by a young girl. It seems the phrase, the actors were confused but the onlooker saw clearly, is truly not false. Just now, your distinguished self intended to kill me in order to silence me. You're not wrong. If there was a second path, I definitely wouldn't have the heart to kill this brother. Brother's sword-controlling technique could be said to be marvelous beyond compare. This one truly admires it. Han Li sighed, halting his steps nearby and helplessly saying as he faced the large man. It seems that even with a death oath, your esteemed self will not be convinced. After a short moment, the large man said this overbearingly with an encompassing radiance shining from his eyes. You're not wrong. I only believe that dead men can keep secrets. Han Li's expression sunk as he replied with a bone-chilling tone. Good, since this is the case, we don't need to speak rubbish. Only one of us will leave here alive, the barefooted man heroically said with raised eyebrows. Only one of us will live. That's wrong. It should be said that your esteemed self's death is certain. After Han Li heard the large man's words, he strangely smiled and lightly said this as he shook his head. Nonsense. You believe that because you've trapped my silver sheen sword for the time being that your victory is certain. I have many methods you have yet to experience. The large man grew furious as he heard Han Li's words, and he immediately yelled in response. In addition, he raised his arm, and silver light suddenly sparkled from his hand. A sword streak similar to the silver sword unexpectedly appeared in midair. Your esteemed self did not yet take note of this. The distance between us is already within 30 meters. Han Li was looking at the large man with a peculiar expression and sighed. Soon after, his figure became indistinct and completely disappeared into the air. So long as I am within 30 meters of someone and no defensive technique are used, that person's life or death is basically mine to decide. Han Li's voice became a hollow echo. Suddenly, he appeared pressed up behind the fear-stricken large man. He said the last word of his sentence as he appeared. And now you are already dead. Han Li softly muttered this as he slowly withdrew the thread he had just waved. The large man motionlessly looked forward with a lifeless expression. A thin red line suddenly appeared on his neck. His head was still for a moment before smoothly rolling off his neck, truly as dead can be. Han Li then turned his body and looked at the two-part corpse. A trace of pity flashed on his face. This large man's strength was no less than that of Feng Yue. However, he was careless and actually let Han Li approach to such a close distance. His death could not be regarded as unjust. Do you also want to kill and silence me? Han Li suddenly heard these feeble words, laced with suspicious vigilance and restless fear. Chapter 203, Worry-Free Needle and Forgetful Dust Pill. Han Li began to bitterly laugh. Although he had gotten rid of the fellow from the giant sword sect, he still had to deal with the largest problem at hand. The green-clothed young woman's slim and frail body, her deathly pale and thin face, and the panic in her eyes were all completely and distinctly reflected in his eyes the moment that Han Li slightly shifted his eyes and swept the scene. It seemed as if the shock she had received was truly not small. He did not respond to the young woman's inquiry, instead bending over and picking up the storage pouch on the big man's corpse. Then, he flicked the tip of his finger, and a small fireball hit the corpse, turning it into ash in a brief moment. Afterwards, he used the azure stasis mirror to withdraw the azure light binding the silver sword and the gold blades together, then released the huge sword and the golden blades, storing them in his storage pouch. It was only at this time that Han Li turned around and walked towards the young woman expressionlessly. When the young woman saw that Han Li truly was getting closer to her, her already deathly pale face became even more pale without a trace of blood. She could not help but fearfully shrink back a few steps. What do you want to do? If you come over, I won't be polite anymore. The green-clothed young woman finally mustered up her courage and reached her hand into her storage pouch, pulling out a small black sword and pointing it at the Han Li in front of her. However, Han Li had determined in a glance that this sword was only a trash mid-grade magic tool. It seemed like that yellow silk handkerchief was that woman's only top-grade magic tool. Is this how this young lady treats the great kindness of being saved? Han Li suddenly rubbed his nose and asked as he smiled. The great kindness of being saved. The young woman stared blankly for a moment, somewhat confused by Han Li's drastic change in appearance from before to now. It seemed as if she had not yet recovered from it. This young lady is really an eminent person with a short memory. If I hadn't made a move back then and saved this young woman from that person's sword, why would I want to make any kind of shady business like silencing you? Han Li said, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. Oh, I'm really sorry. I was scared and I forgot. The young woman was suddenly enlightened and remembered this matter, so she hurriedly explained as her face flushed, stuttering in a bewildered manner. If one saw it, one would feel pity. It's not much. However, it is somewhat inconceivable that we would actually meet here after having the pleasure of having met once at the Great South Valley. Han Li waved his hand and said cordially. He didn't know why, but whenever he saw this woman's bashful appearance, Han Li felt incredibly intimate, as if he were with his own younger sister from his family. My name is Han Li. What is this young lady called? Han Li opened his mouth and asked very carelessly. I'm called Han Yunjai, the young woman said after a brief moment of hesitation, her face scarlet. She felt incredibly bashful after voluntarily speaking her name in front of this young man. TL, her surname, meaning lotus blossom, and Han Li's are different. Han Yunja, a very good name, it fits this young lady. Han Li lightly laughed, repeating the young woman's name. Really? The red color on Han Yunja's face rose again. However, why did young lady Han enter the Spirit Beast Mountain and come to attend the trial by blood and fire? Han Li asked, somewhat curious. Han Yunjai's face displayed a moment of difficulty. She hesitated and chose not to say it. Since it's somewhat difficult to answer, you don't need to tell me. I was only asking thoughtlessly. Han Li added in empathy, causing Han Yunjai to feel very grateful. Right, we had better enter the stone room and gather the spiritual medicines, lest a long night is fraught with dreams and other people arrive here. Han Li suddenly said after carelessly conversing with the young woman for a while. TL, a long night fraught with dreams, means a long delay might lead to more hitches. Han Yunjai nodded repeatedly when she heard this, but afterwards she said again, somewhat abashedly. Big brother Han, could you let me have those few fierce sun blossoms? I only want those flowers, I won't ask for anything else more. Of course it's not a problem. Even if young lady Han had not said it, I was already planning on doing it this way. Han Li replied after hearing this, lightly laughing. Many thanks, big brother Han. When the young woman heard this, she immediately expressed her thanks repeatedly, her face revealing a joyful expression. She felt even more grateful towards Han Li. Since it's like this, why doesn't young lady Han go gather the fierce sun blossoms first? Don't let me accidentally take them away. Han Li recommended calmly, laughing once. Okay then. Hearing this, the young woman felt that it was somewhat reasonable and lowered her head, paying her respects to Han Li. Then she turned around to walk towards the stone room. But when the young woman had just turned around, she suddenly heard Han Li sigh. Then she felt a sharp pain in the back of her head and her vision went black, falling unconscious onto the ground. However, when she was a few feet from the ground, she was stopped by being hugged from behind. It turned out that Han Li had taken advantage of the moment. The young woman had turned around to suddenly move himself behind Han Yunjai and gently knock her out with one blow. He then used his two hands to hold her soft, jade-like body. Han Li, holding up the young woman's curves and smelling the beautiful and serene smell of the young woman's body, was shaken in his state of mind. He couldn't help but to lower his head and kiss the young woman's fragrant cheek. However, he immediately regained his senses and bit the tip of his tongue, immediately becoming much more sober. Looking at the young woman's beautiful appearance, he began to bitterly laugh incessantly. He first gently laid the young woman against a wall of the stone room, and then in a flash he entered the room. After a brief moment, when he had cleaned out all of the spiritual medicines inside of the room, he walked out again. He then picked up the young woman again, and his figure swayed a bit before disappearing in an outcrop of mountainous rocks to the side. Inside a naturally formed stone cave near the peak of the ring-shaped mountain, Han Li laid the young woman flat on the ground. Then, he sat cross-legged to the side, closed his eyes and began to recover. Han Li finally opened his eyes. A mysterious light flickered in them, and he displayed his incredibly fast movement technique. He finally was able to recover some energy. It was only now that he retrieved a palm-sized, delicate silver box from his storage pouch. Han Li gazed at this silver box and seemed to be somewhat entranced. After a while, he silently opened the lid to the box, revealing a neatly arranged row of silver needles inside. They were exactly the acupuncture items that he had often used before at the Seven Mysteries Sect. Han Li lifted his hand and gently caressed the silver needles of all sizes. The figures of Dr. Mo, Li Feiyu, etc. couldn't help but be vivid in his mind. It was as if his life in God Hand Valley was something that transpired only yesterday. He couldn't help but sigh with much sorrow. After a brief mental journey, Han Li's train of thought finally flew back to him. He settled his mind, and then used two fingers to deftly draw out a long and thin silver needle in a very practiced motion. The needle appeared between his fingers. Then Han Li looked at the young woman and then at the needle in his hand. A helpless expression appeared between his eyebrows. Young lady Han, if it wasn't for me being eased by this needle technique, which can eliminate a person's short-term memory, I really wouldn't know how I would deal with my secret being revealed. Although I believe that you would sincerely try to keep my secret from me, during this time too many accidents will occur. Perhaps you would unintentionally leak it out, or other people would use secret techniques to dig out this matter without you knowing. I have no choice but to protect against this. Han Li murmured to himself. Immediately, he brought out a red porcelain bottle and poured out a strong-smelling fiery red medicinal pill from it. He then unhesitatingly stuffed it into the young woman's mouth. TL degrees. Luckily, I also brought the forgetful dust pill that I had carelessly concocted before with me. This way, I can fully display my worry-free needle technique without having to worry about the future. Although it is still slightly dangerous, there shouldn't be any big problems anymore. You will only forget the things that have happened in this half-day. I really didn't expect that the needle technique I had learned from Dr. Mo's relics could actually be used today in the cultivating world, Han Li said with affection as he touched the young woman's beautiful hair. After a few hours, Han Li walked out of the cave, his face deathly pale. He hastily hid in a nearby large tree and then attentively watched the circumstances at the tunnel entrance. After a quarter of an hour, Han Yunjai walked out with a vacant expression, holding a few fierce sun blossoms in her hand. She peered around at the cave entrance a few times, a hand on her forehead. Her eyes slowly revealed a strange expression. Suddenly, it seemed as if she had thought of something important. She hurriedly placed the fierce sun blossoms inside of her storage pouch, and she hurriedly left that area, shooting down the mountain. Not long after she left, Han Li leaped down from the tree. After gazing at the direction the young woman had disappeared to, he let out a long sigh, then slowly headed towards a dense forest on the other side. The third day in the forbidden area had finally ended. The fourth day's arrival, to Han Li, went much less smoothly than the day before. If it wasn't encountering and being chased by other strong demonic beasts, it was that his information had mistakes. The locations where spiritual medicines grew didn't actually contain the ones that Han Li needed. As for the demonic beasts guarding the spiritual medicines, their numbers also abruptly increased. In just half a day, Han Li had killed 3 medium-level and 2 high-level demonic beasts in immediate succession. Regardless of whether it was his magic power or his physical energy, Han Li was unable to endure the exertion. Now Han Li stood below a huge cliff, assessing his harvests. Although the quantities of the 3 spiritual medicines had not completely reached his expected goal, they were just barely enough. Even if he were to leave the forbidden area now, it was not something that he could not accept. In addition, the information from the Yellow Maple Valley clearly indicated that there were no more locations where spiritual medicines were yet to ripen. The remaining locations were all from the information that he had exchanged with Zhang Yue. There were actually a few more. However, previously Han Li was always afraid that the other person's intelligence was inaccurate, leading him on a wild goose chase and wasting his time. But when Han Li skimmed through this externally obtained information again, he immediately discovered that there was another location not too far from his current position that concealed and grew many spiritual medicines. That place not only had spiritual medicines that had yet to ripen, there was even supposed to be many ripe spiritual medicines. This caused Han Li to be somewhat tempted. According to his speculations, if the ripe spiritual medicines there hadn't already been taken by Zhang Yue, they still should have been taken first by other people. However, the yet-to-ripen spiritual medicine should still be there. Since it was still early and he did not have a predetermined destination, it wouldn't be a bad thing for him to run there and take a look. Even if the information was incorrect, he would not have any losses. Having reached this intention, Han Li could no longer sit still. After resting for a brief moment, he leaped up to depart. Chapter 204, The Stone Temple and the Underground Passageway. The place that Han Li intended to go to was located within some basin on the ring-shaped mountain. It was surrounded by large, strangely shaped rocks that shielded it from the elements. Square in the middle of this basin was an ancient, huge azure stone temple. Although the stone temple was huge, the door to the temple was pitifully small. It could only allow 2 people to enter in side by side. This gave Han Li, who was standing on top of the rocks and gazing at it, an extremely strange feeling of discordance. Han Li knitted his eyebrows and jumped off the rocks. Then, he leisurely walked near the temple door, raising his head to look at this stone temple. As he looked at it, the suspicion on his face became even more evident. He didn't know if it was an illusion, but he always felt that on this stone temple's surface, pale azure light would occasionally flow. However, when he wanted to take a careful, close look at it, he was unable to see any difference. After doing this a few times, he began to quietly whisper to himself. Could people really have set some kind of magic technique here? Han Li lowered his head, scanning the ground around him. He was unable to find any traces of people arriving before him, causing him to squint his eyes. There's definitely something odd. Although this basin is somewhat remote, with this huge temple here, there's no way that other people haven't discovered it. Even more so, my own information was given to me by that guy Feng Yue. How could he not have arrived at this place before? In a moment, Han Li's heart had already run through numerous different ideas. He subconsciously felt that something was wrong. But he was also somewhat unwilling to leave this place just like that. Thus he retreated a few steps, feeling around inside his storage pouch. A golden blade appeared in his hand, and he flung it into the air. It became a streak of golden light, fiercely striking a random azure stone on top of the temple door. With a puchai, the azure stone flooded with azure light, safe and sound, while the golden blade flipped a few times in the air, having been reflected tens of meters away. Han Li shook his head and turned around, about to leave this place. The main goal is to avoid pointless dangers and walk out of the forbidden area alive. This stone temple is so strange, it's best if I don't go in there, Han Li thought, his expression unchanging. But Han Li had just taken 2 steps when the color of his face dramatically changed. His figure flashed, and he disappeared into the air. Then, Han Li's figure appeared again inside of the temple door, but it immediately disappeared again into the stone temple. At this time, a huge flock of masked Moon Sect disciples suddenly appeared on some of the rocks of the basin to the side. The leader was the seemingly young fairy woman, who was actually a martial ancestor of the masked Moon Sect. At this moment, the young woman gazed at the temple door where Han Li had disappeared with a trace of suspicion. She had felt that there was someone in this place, but now she saw that there was not a single person in sight. Could her instincts have been wrong? The young woman stood still, unwilling to believe any falsehoods. She gently closed her eyes and released her tremendous divine sense all at once. In the end, other than their group of people, she did not sense that there were any other cultivators nearby the basin area. However, when her divine sense swept over the stone temple, it was repelled outside by some kind of strength, causing the young woman to be shocked. However, she immediately began to rejoice, a trace of laughter hanging on her face. Upon first glance, she had already discovered that this stone temple had already had a restrictive technique cast on it by someone. This did not surprise her, because the 10 or so demonic beasts they had swept aside all had a restrictive technique cast on their secret acupuncture points. This could not amount to much. However, the restrictive technique here could not be penetrated even by her divine sense. This was the first time she had encountered such a situation. The superficial restrictive techniques from before simply could not compare. In a moment of excitement, the young fairy woman did not want to pursue the matter from before anymore. She trusted that even if there really were 1 or 2 disciples from other sects nearby peeping, they would definitely not be willing to create a disturbance with so many people from the masked Moon Sect. Thus, she took the lead to walk towards the stone temple. Han Li at this time was standing in the large lobby of the stone temple, so anxious that he was spinning around frantically in circles. He had just been about to leave. Thus, he had first let out his divine sense to assess the situations in his surroundings and prepare to leave. However, he had never expected that just as he had released his divine sense, he would immediately sense a huge group of cultivators so close to him. He was so surprised that all of the blood in his body almost congealed, and so he flashed into the stone temple without thinking. Regardless of which of the other 6 sects these people outside were from, if they saw him here, one would not need to think too much to know what his fate would be. In reality, if it weren't for his energy expenditures being too high in these past 2 days, he completely could have used his extremely speedy movement techniques and unabashedly shake off these cultivators from his sleeve and leave. Unfortunately, based on his current condition, this kind of movement technique could not be used many more times. Even if he wanted to run, he wouldn't be able to run very far. Currently, he was safe, hiding inside the stone temple. However, he also had been blocked in by that group of cultivators, with no way of leaving anymore. Actually, this stone temple's construction was too simple. After entering the temple door and walking through a serpentine, winding hallway, an empty, large lobby appeared in front of his eyes. The entire hollow, large lobby actually did not have even a single place for him to hide. Upon looking at the attitude of the flock of people outside, they definitely came for this stone temple. Wishing for those people not to come inside was purely a vain attempt. In actuality, to say that there definitely was no place for him to go was not entirely true. In front of Han Li's eyes, in the center of the large lobby, was a black tunnel surrounded by jade railings. The tunnel entrance had a row of stairs, directly slanting into the ground from the entrance. It was also incessantly blowing out warm, humid air. It was truly difficult to imagine where this tunnel would lead one to. However, Han Li could also guess without thinking that the place this tunnel led to would definitely not be a nice place. It would definitely be extremely ruthless, which was why he had been hesitant to enter. However, there truly were no other places for him to hide in this large temple. This caused the cold sweat on Han Li's forehead to gush out all at once with a shua. And at this time, the sound of chaotic footsteps came floating over from the temple entrance. It seemed that group of cultivators had already entered the stone temple and would enter this lobby in the time it takes to roll one's eye. Seeing this, bitterly sighed in his heart. Then, gritting his teeth, he lightly jumped over the railings and slipped into the tunnel. After entering the tunnel, Han Li's surroundings were pitch black. He used his hand to reach into his storage pouch and retrieve the moonlight stone, and only then did his surroundings light up. The entire tunnel could not be considered to be large. It was entirely built out of azure stone and could allow one person to barely pass through it. Han Li touched the stone wall in passing. it was somewhat damp and slippery. He did not dare to tarry at all, fearful that the people behind him would catch up to him. Thus, he walked downwards carefully. After following the stone steps underneath his feet one by one for a few hundred steps, the originally narrow tunnel slowly began to widen, and it could already fit two people side by side with no issues. However, the humid wind blowing from in front of him became increasingly hot, causing Han Li to sweat profusely. He had long been drenched with sweat from head to toe. After walking down close to another 100 steps, Han Li estimated he was already roughly 100 or more steps below the Earth's surface. The azure tunnel finally disappeared. When he walked out of the tunnel's entrance, what appeared before his eyes was actually a strange, swampy world. This underground world was only 300 meters or so high, but its circumference reached the length of a few kilometers. With a glance, sludge-emitting black water bubbles was everywhere. That hot, humid wind was being generated in the air above the swamp, speedily flowing through the tunnel behind Han Li. Then, it would bring back in more clean air from outside the tunnel, thus actually forming an equilibrium of flow rate. All around the swamp were these tall, large mounds of black dirt. At the other end of the swamp grew a few tens of differently colored strange spiritual herbs. The few kinds of spiritual medicines that Han Li required were also in this group, and their quantities were truly not low either. However, all of this was not as attractive of Han Li's attention as a small white jade pavilion in the middle of the swamp. This was because a golden, huge chest, roughly 10 to 20 meters long and 5 meters wide, was floating in midair in the pavilion. Its lid was tightly shut, and its body had faint golden light flowing around it. One glance and one could tell it was definitely not a common object. Han Li only glanced at it a few times before immediately shifting his gaze. This wasn't because Han Li was not moved by the treasures inside of this golden chest, but rather because a huge group of malicious people were about to arrive. It would be best to quickly find a hiding place, since this was the truly pressing matter. Otherwise, his small life would be lost. What use would the treasures be to him? Han Li's figure swayed a bit, and he slipped over to a random dirt mound far away from the tunnel entrance. Then, he restrained his chi in one breath, utilizing a full-strength concealing technique. Next, he lay on top of the dirt mound unmoving. After hiding his appearance, Han Li was already beginning to blend into one entity with the black dirt. Gazing at it from afar, one would not be able to easily discover his traces. Han Li had not prepared all of this for too long before the young fairy woman's figure appeared on the stairs at the tunnel entrance. As soon as she appeared, she indifferently assessed the circumstances in this area. When she saw the huge golden chest in the white jade pavilion, her previously expressionless face finally began to be emotionally moved, and her eyes gradually revealed a fiery passion. Although she had heard disciples from her sect describing the golden chest here, she was much more astonished upon seeing it up close and in person. The young woman walked down the steps, neatly standing in front of the swamp. The male and female disciples of the masked moon sect following closely behind her all clambered and surged forth in an instant, forming a straight line behind the young woman. In a place not too far away from where he had clearly seen all of this, he could not help but quietly grow apprehensive. At the same time, his curiosity was greatly aroused regarding that leading young woman's identity. Is this where the black scaly python is hidden? The young woman's voice delicately sounded out, yet it was filled with an unspeakable dignity. Reporting to Martial Ancestor, that huge python is hidden inside of the swamp. It has previously swallowed 10 or so disciples from various sects who had wanted to obtain the treasure chest. Its vicious reputation is widespread, and it has caused this place to become a forbidden area where disciples from the various sects no longer dare to come. However, this demonic beast truly is much stronger than regular top-level demonic beasts. This one still hopes that Martial Ancestor takes special care. A young woman replied respectfully, lowering her head. Heng, did you think that I would be unable to even deal with a grade 1 demonic beast? The young woman's delicate small face fell, and she adopted a ridiculous elderly air. However, this caused the expression of the white-clothed woman who had replied to drastically change, repeatedly saying, I do not dare. You can withdraw. Everyone, follow the original plan to act. No matter how powerful this black scaly python is, it definitely isn't the yin-yang pulling magic's opponent. No matter how strong it is still a grade 1 demonic beast, the young woman said with an unquestionable tone, lifting the spirits of all the disciples behind her. After giving orders to all of the disciples, the young woman turned around and looked at the swamp in front of her, using a faint voice to murmur to herself. It seems like that object should be inside of this chest. The previous few locations were all a waste. All I got was some trash. The young woman's voice was inaudible. Apart from herself, the other disciples could not hear anything at all. They were all extremely excited for the imminent, upcoming big battle. After the young woman's orders had been passed down, the male and female disciples from the masked moon sect immediately stood side by side with their Tao companions. They actually both reached out a hand very skillfully and held them together. Suddenly, the two overlapping hands individually emitted a blue and red strange brilliance. Then, following down their arms, it spread to these disciples' entire bodies, causing the 6 pairs of masked moon sect disciples to be covered with light, red light shrouding the males' bodies, blue light shooting off of the females, forming a strange blue-red crisscross shape. Only 3 disciples remained, 1 male and 2 female, having already lost their Tao companions. They could only bring out some magic tools, merely making some basic preparations. Hanli lay on the mound of dirt. Although he had not heard the young woman murmuring to herself, he had exactly heard the female disciple in front call her martial ancestor. This instantly caused him to almost bite his tongue and injure it in a moment of surprise. Martial ancestor of the masked moon sect. What was this notion? Hanli was already no longer a rookie in the cultivation world, and he was very clear about this situation. That was a core formation cultivator expert who was of the same level as his sect's martial ancestor Li. That this kind of an expert would actually appear in the forbidden area, which was restricted from cultivators of the foundation establishment stage and above, caused Han Li's head to whirl. At this time, seeing that all of her sect's disciples were properly prepared, the young woman began to take action contentedly. The young woman faintly opened her dainty mouth and spat out her magic treasure, the vermilion bird band. When this item came out from her mouth, it immediately whirled through the air as it traveled above the swamp and expanded to the same size as a small building. Next, the young woman beneath it formed hand incantations for a magic technique and pointed with her finger. A streak of red light shot from her hand to the ring. In an instant, the band's color rapidly changed from pink to a fiery, blazing red. On top of the dirt mound, Han Li was stunned by what he saw. This kind of impact and strength. If one said that this wasn't a magic treasure, one could beat him to death and he wouldn't believe it. Since the young woman could control this magic treasure, her identity as a core formation cultivator was undoubtable. But how was she able to make her way into the forbidden area, and why was her magic power only at the peak of the chi condensation stage? These string of questions flew around in Han Li's head, but he still had no way of answering them. The young woman had yet to take the next step when the swamp below began to show signs of movement. With a certain part of the swamp as the center, the nearby silt began to roil. In addition, the roiling area became greater and greater, and the waves higher and higher. It actually slowly formed into a huge protrusion, the sight of which was extremely shocking. A trace of doubt flitted across the young woman's face when she saw this. Based on her memories, the black scale python had never seemed to be this imposing. However, seeing that the demonic beast's appearance was imminent, the young woman did not dare to hesitate. Her 2 hands formed hand incantations for the blue flower magic technique, with her attention connected to the huge vermilion bird band, which began to spin in the air. In a short amount of time, it became blurry because of how fast it was spinning. The hundreds of fireballs inside of it also became a red sea of fire in the time it takes to roll one's eyes, actually dissolving into one entity. Go! The young woman spit out as her magic technique suddenly stabilized. All of a sudden, the round ring spinning stopped abruptly, and the encapsulated sea of flames thus suddenly became a thick, large fire cyclone pillar that aggressively shot out downwards, directly spurting towards the huge protrusion from the swamp. However, before the flame column had neared the swamp, a column of black, inky water as thick as a bowl's opening shot out of the silt protrusion with a puche, just in time to block the flames shooting towards it. Suddenly, the explosions filled the air, and a large ball of mist immediately rose up in pieces, causing the surroundings to be steaming with fog in the blink of an eye. Everything became blurry. This isn't the black scale python. The young woman's originally somewhat doubtful expression, upon seeing the column of water that was as dark as ink, immediately changed as she spoke. As if replying to the young woman's words, the sound of a wail came from the vast white fog. An extremely strange, piercing scream began to sound and pierce towards the sky. Then, with a hula, an extremely hot gust of wind began to blow, causing the surrounding white air to disappear with a roll, revealing the true colors of the demonic beast. A black, swarthy, snake-shaped demon covered with huge scales appeared before everyone's eyes. This seemingly snake-like yet not a snake demonic beast's bulk was not actually too big, only 30 to 40 meters long. However, its entire body from head to toe was shrouded by a layer of faint black fog, appearing extremely demonic. In addition, its external appearance from head to tail was not much different from that of a regular black python. Of course, its black and shiny hug scales were an exception. Inky Flood Dragon. The young woman, upon clearly seeing the demonic beast's appearance, couldn't help but cry out. Her face revealed an apprehensive yet excited expression. However, the 10 or so disciples standing behind her were somewhat puzzled. Wasn't this the black scaly python? Since when did it become some inky flood dragon? The young woman couldn't afford to explain clearly to all the disciples, because the demonic beast floating numerous meters above the ground had already found the main culprit in disturbing its rest. The two small, green eyes on the side of its head flashed malevolently. It opened its mouth, and another black column of water leaped towards the people from the masked moon sect. Beast, you're looking to die. The young woman knew very well the strength of the inky flood dragon. Although this demonic beast seemed as if it was young, she did not dare to be careless at all. She hurriedly controlled the vermilion bird band, instantly releasing a red ring of light that suddenly flashed and blocked in front of the young woman. Then, a string of fireballs came flying out from within the ring, causing that black water to be stopped halfway to its destination. Receive speed, restrain, arrest, lock. The young woman's two hands formed a half-half contained a full moon, as she uninspiringly spit out these 5 words from her mouth. When these 5 words had just left her mouth, the vermilion bird band began to jitter rapidly in midair. Then, it began to emit a low ring and disappeared into thin air. This caused the spiritually wise inky flood dragon to blink its small eyes, staring blankly because of it. But the next instant, the ring actually directly appeared on the demonic beast's forehead while humming. It took advantage of the demonic beast's slowness to react and instantly sank down, then rapidly became much smaller. In the blink of an eye, the vermilion bird band actually abruptly wrapped around the inky flood dragon's midsection, and then a fiery light rose up rapidly on the ring. Instantly, half of the demonic beast's body was enveloped in the fierce flames. Move quickly, I can't contain this inky flood dragon for too long. Although the vermilion bird band had securely wrapped the demonic beast, the young woman didn't have any relaxing expression. Instead, she sent out commands behind her with anxiety. Although the masked moon sect disciples behind her did not know how the black scaly python had suddenly become the inky flood dragon that their martial ancestor informed them about, this did not prevent them from releasing the offensive that they had prepared a long time ago. Attack! Under the orders of a relatively elderly, white-clothed female, 10 columns of red and blue intersecting light were released from these male and female disciples' bodies, emitting an appalling kai-kai sound that tore through the air. They unmistakably attacked the immobile demonic beast. A series of loud hong-hong sounds spread out. When these columns had just reached near the demonic beast's body, they were forcibly blocked by the faint black fog that shrouded its body. Fierce bursting sounds rang out. Continue to attack. The inky flood dragon's protective fog can't hold on much longer. The young woman commanded hastily, her eyes sharp. At the same time, she continued to push the red flaming technique on the vermilion bird band, causing the flames surrounding the demonic beast to become even more vigorous. Under the string of commands from the young woman, the masked moon sect disciples incessantly shot out individual columns of red and blue light, hitting the demonic beast's body. Although they had yet to break through that layer of black fog, they had already caused that demonic beast to howl and go crazy. It bared its teeth and viciously shook the 2 halves of its body that were able to move, furiously trying to break free from the ring's grasp. However, its struggle was futile. Under the young woman's all-out efforts to restrict it, the round ring was fixed in midair, not moving even a little, thoroughly locking down its body. Watching from the side, Han Li was struck with fright. He had never seen the spectacle of a group of cultivators this large battling a common enemy. Even more, the appearance of the magic treasure and fact that the opponent was a demonic beast that wasn't weak was a big eye-opener for him. However, Han Li also decided that whether the demonic beast beat its enemies or the masked moon sect people killed the demonic beast, he would quietly sneak away after the big battle. This was not the time to casually expose his own tracks. Woo! Just as Han Li was entertaining all sorts of ideas in his head, the inky flood dragon suddenly let out a long cry, its sound numerous times louder than before. At the same time, its scream was filled with pain. Han Li was startled and immediately fixed his gaze there. He saw that the black fog on the demonic beast had already completely dissipated, and a bowl-opening wide bloody hole had appeared on the area of its body covered by the huge scales. Evidently, it had been hurt by the red and blue columns of light. The agony also caused the demonic beast's struggling to become even more crazy. It seems that the people from the masked moon sect are of a higher skill level. Han Li couldn't help but think after seeing this. Not good, everyone be careful. I can't contain this inky flood dragon any longer. Han Li was stunned when he heard the young woman. It was difficult to tell who the winner would be. The young woman's words startled the masked moon disciples. From their experiences in the past 2 days, so long as the top-grade demonic beasts had been bound by their martial ancestor, they would be bound for quite a while. How was this demonic beast able to escape so quickly? Although their hearts were filled with doubt, they did not dare to ignore the young woman's warning, and they immediately became extremely cautious. Of course, the attack of the red and blue columns of light from their hands became even more fierce. In the time it takes to roll one's eyes, 10 or so more bloody holes appeared on the inky flood dragon's body. The fresh, red flood dragon blood stained a large part of the swamp below it red. Of course, this enraged the flood dragon even more. It opened its mouth and let out a piercing, endless howl, causing the entire underground area to quake and drone. This caused all of the people there to be hit by a sudden bout of dizziness as everything seemed to spin. With a rip, a strange tearing sound rang out in midair. When everybody regained consciousness and focused on taking a look, their expressions drastically changed. The band was still floating in midair unmoving. However, the inky flood dragon demonic beast within it had disappeared into thin air, leaving behind its tattered skin which hung on top of the band and fluttered incessantly. This demonic beast had actually shed its skin and escaped. Not only were the masked moon sect disciples surprised, but even the young woman, when she saw the scene in front of her, was extremely stunned. When she had yelled at her sect's disciples to be careful, it wasn't because she had expected this flood dragon to shed its skin. The inky flood dragon's escaping power was too great. Her magic strength truly was not enough to continue to contain it. Having experienced the restrictive power of the vermilion bird band, the demonic beast should have also known this. So why would it make a move that hurt so much of its vitality? Could it be? The young woman's heart moved, and she thought of a frightening reason. Her face was painted completely white, and she hurriedly searched everywhere for the inky flood dragon, wanting to verify her own extremely terrible guess. It's over there. A sharp-eyed masked moon sect disciple was the first to discover the demonic beast incessantly swimming around near the topmost part of the underground area. At this time, it had a completely new look, its form very different from how it was before. Its black body had become snow-white without scales, and its originally 30-40 foot long body had increased to 50-60 feet, and it also widened significantly. Only faint scars remained where it had been injured, so faint that it was almost invisible. The most shocking thing was that the triangular snake body had grown an inch long, jet black sharp horns, a faint light shining through it. Its midsection had also grown an extra pair of incomparably sharp white claws. This demonic beast had actually turned from a snake into a flood dragon, and its form had become exactly the same as the legendary flood dragon. Seeing this form of the inky flood dragon, the people from the masked moon sect were naturally extremely shocked. However, before they were able to make any moves, the young woman standing at the very front gave out an order with an ashen face that caused them to feel very stunned. Everyone immediately retreat. The inky flood dragon has already reached grade 2. Its strength is far above core formation cultivators. All of us combined are not its opponent. Immediately escape this area. I can delay it for a short while. After the young woman said this solemnly, she immediately waved her hand, causing that vermilion bird band to return in front of her. She then assumed a completely defensive posture. When the male and female disciples behind her heard this, they started to hesitate somewhat. Although that inky flood dragon had shed its skin and its appearance had drastically changed, they were just inflicting heavy wounds on it. It was hard for them to believe that the strength of this demonic beast could become vastly different in the blink of an eye. But in the moment that they hesitated, it was enough for them to regret it for life. This was because the white inky flood dragon suddenly moved its body and rushed like lightning towards the space above all of the masked moon sect people. Then, it opened its mouth wide, and an endless torrent of purple liquid spurted out of its mouth. "Quickly hide, you can't receive it." The young woman hurriedly yelled out, her expression one of anxiety. At the same time, the vermilion bird band immediately increased multiple times in size, and it flew out and blocked the greater half of the purple liquid. Hearing this, some of the more quick-witted disciples either immediately turned around and slipped into the azure stone tunnel or advanced a few steps and hid within the cover of the banned magic treasure. The remaining 5 or 6 disciples, however, were confident in the strength of their magic tools. Not only did they not hide, but they actually released 1 or 2 shiny objects, protecting their own foreheads. It seemed as if they decided to face it head-on. Idiots! The young woman, seeing some of the disciples not listening to her words, revealed a furious expression, green light flashing across her face. However, her magic power was limited, and she had no way to increase the cover of the magic treasure. She could only leave them to fend for themselves. As expected, what happened afterwards proved that what the young woman had said was true. The unblocked purple liquid fiercely spurted towards those disciples' foreheads. Those magic tools that, at a glance, did not seem common, flashed a few times, then emitted a few plumes of azure smoke and disappeared under the onslaught of purple liquid, having been completely melted. Those few masked moon sect disciples only had time to yell out before disappearing without a trace under the onslaught of purple liquid. Only a large hole a few tens of feet deep remained where they had once stood. This caused the surviving masked moon sect disciples to become deathly pale. At this time, having wiped out those few disciples, the oppressive feeling from the inky flood dragon slightly dissipated, and it finally closed its mouth and stopped spitting. Instead, it gazed at the young woman with cold eyes. It was as if it was very clear that this martial ancestor from the masked moon sect was its formidable adversary. "Why are you still staring? Still not quickly leaving? This beast just turned from a snake into a flood dragon. It should not have too much damn liquid remaining, and it won't lightly spit it out." The young woman coldly commanded with a chilly face, not pay attention to the gaze of the inky flood dragon. Then she bitterly said to herself, "You're only a small snake that just reached grade 2, yet you still dare to act so arrogantly in front of me. If I had recovered the magic power that I originally had, I would have captured you long ago and have you guard my immortal's cave." Ignoring the young woman's unwilling expression, how could the other masked moon sect disciples, having seen the tragedy that befell those few people, dare to stay even for a moment? They immediately and obediently retreated into the tunnel with a hula, and then rushed wildly towards the outside. Not long afterwards, sounds of a demonic beast's roars came from behind them, as well as the young woman's gentle scolding and the rumbling sounds of a battle. These disciples scrambled wildly up the stairs, while at the same time being filled with fear. Their martial ancestor had clearly said that she could only entangle it for a short while. If they walked too slowly and were caught again by the inky flood dragon, each person would receive a mouthful of that frightening purple liquid. There was no room to dodge in this tunnel, so they would die an unjust death. At this time, the young woman was flying back and forth in the air and incessantly harassing the inky flood dragon, her fragrant sweat dripping from her body. That vermilion bird band magic treasure was superbly used by her, provoking the demonic beast to roar in anger continuously. However, the flood dragon was also unable to do anything to the young woman, whose movement techniques were extremely abrupt. The young woman obviously had yet to use her full strength, only using one hand to control the vermilion bird band, while the other hand held a fire-red spirit stone, continuously sucking out its spiritual chi in an attempt to recover her own magic power. After the young woman felt that enough time had passed, she retrieved the fire attribute spirit stone and took out a bright gold talisman. Without saying anything else, she took advantage of when the inky flood dragon's attention was fully attracted by the vermilion bird band to raise her hand, and that talisman became a streak of golden light, shooting towards the demonic beast. When it arrived in front of its body, the golden light suddenly separated into countless golden strands, suddenly and securely binding that demonic beast. It was unable to move even a tiny bit, angering it and causing another burst of wild roars. A trace of mockery flitted across her eyes when she saw this. Then, she reluctantly glanced at the golden chest floating in the white jade pavilion before gritting her teeth and flying back to the tunnel entrance and landing there. She was very clear that this intermediate mid-grade golden strands talisman could not bind the demonic beast for too long. It would be best for her to leave this place early. As for the treasures inside of that golden chest, she would think of ways to obtain them later. The young woman landed, wanting to raise her leg and step into the azure stone tunnel, but a deafening cry suddenly came thundering from the tunnel. This cry came closer and closer and grew louder and louder, causing the young woman to be a little alarmed and uncertain. The elegant foot that she had raised actually did not dare to enter the tunnel for a while. A A dazzling azure light suddenly appeared within the tunnel, sweeping through the tunnel like a torrential tide. Wherever it went, all of the azure stone tunnel seemed to come alive, furiously extruding towards the middle. In the blink of an eye, the many tens of feet tall tunnel appeared to have no gap whatsoever. When the young woman saw this, she hurriedly retreated numerous steps, as if she had seen a ghost and couldn't help but cry out. Small 5 elements Zumi mountain magic. Then her face was deathly pale, and she stared foolishly at the disappearing tunnel. The self-confident expression she had always had disappeared completely in an instant. At this time, in midair behind the young woman, the golden strands on the inky flood dragon's body began to tear inch by inch. This demonic beast was about to break through its restrictions in the time it took to roll one's eyes. When the young woman had recovered and turned around to see this happen, her heart thumped even harder, as if it had fell into an abyss. In the big lobby of the stone temple, outside of the tunnel, 10 or so masked moon sect disciples were staring rigidly at a white-clothed woman. She was actually the crafty woman who had called herself one of the masked moon sect's twin beauties. However, at this moment her face was pale, and she seemed to be completely at a loss. Junior Martial Sister Zhao, what exactly did you do just then? Why is it that after you threw a strange talisman into the tunnel opening disappeared? Could you wanted to murder the Southern Palace martial ancestor? A male masked moon sect disciples asked sternly with a panicked expression. This was not a laughing matter. If this martial ancestor really was to never come out again because of this, their fates would be tragic. After they returned, at best their cultivation bases would be completely destroyed and they would be expelled from the sect. At worst, their lives would be in danger and they would have to suffer. They were very clear about the significance of a loss of a core formation cultivator to the sect. Thus, they became increasingly anxious. I didn't do anything. I only placed an intermediate low-grade, small 5 elements talisman near the entrance, intending to wait for the demonic beast to chase over to activate the talisman, giving it some pain to eat. The white-clothed young woman exclaimed, completely flustered. She was very clear that no matter how strong her background was, it would be useless in the face of causing this kind of disaster. Thinking of the frightening consequences of the young woman not coming out, this woman felt her hands and feet grow cold. Stop speaking nonsense. Let's try and see if we can open up this tunnel and rescue the Southern Palace martial ancestor, snapped a somewhat aged male disciple. This sentence's utterance immediately reminded the masked moon sect disciples. They hurriedly pulled out various colorful magic tools and surrounded the area that was originally the tunnel entrance, incessantly slamming them down, trying to break through the restrictions and save the young woman. After a few hours in the underground world a few hundreds of feet below, the young woman opened her eyes wide and gazed in disbelief at the person who had suddenly appeared. With a hand gesture, this person sent out 7 golden blades to attack the inky flood dragon, while the other hand released a black iron shield, blocking the spitting attack of the inky flood dragon and preventing it from reaching the two people. This person was the Yellow Maple Valley fellow that she had once seen and felt he was somewhat interesting. This person, when her magic power had been depleted from flying around and avoiding the attacks of the inky flood dragon for those few hours, had suddenly appeared from an unknown location, saving her when she was in critical danger. At the same time that Han Li was barely parrying the attacks of the inky flood dragon, he glanced quickly at the young woman's completely surprised face and bitterly laughed in his heart. Originally, Han Li was leisurely watching the entertaining battle between the masked moon sect and the inky flood dragon. In fact, after the inky flood dragon had evolved and leveled up, apart from being very stunned, he did not feel panicked at all. However, when the young woman had wanted to retreat, and after the azure stone tunnel's entrance had suddenly disappeared, Han Li could not continue to sit there idly. Wasn't the disappearance of the tunnel entrance implying that no matter whether it was the young woman or the demonic beast, he would be unable to leave regardless of who was left? This caused Han Li to begin to panic. At this time, the inky flood dragon that had escaped and the young woman began to fight again. Obviously, this masked moon sect martial ancestor was completely at a disadvantage. Even if she continued to coax the band into attacking the inky flood dragon, the defensive ability of the demonic beast with new skin had reached the point where it was unbelievably strong. Regardless of whether she used the band that spurted out fierce flames to incinerate the flood dragon or directly used the body of the magic treasure to attack, she was unable to inflict any serious wounds to it. At most, she would bruise or burn a small section of its body, causing this beast to become even more berserk. Its chase of the young woman also became more frantic, even forcing the young woman into desperate situations numerous times. However, this masked Moon Sect martial ancestor carried many intermediate talismans on her, which caused Han Li to gain a significant amount of enlightenment. Rarely seen talismans like the Fleeing Earth Talisman, Water Prison Talisman, Firebird Talisman, etc. were used in a row and were each clearly seen once by Han Li. Whenever the young woman was about to be injured by the demonic beast, she would throw one out, immediately resulting in strange effects that turned peril into safety. Unfortunately, the young woman obviously did not have any talismans with great destructive power, so every time she could only barely preserve herself. It seemed like relying on talismans to injure the inky flood dragon would not be possible. The struggle inside of Han Li's heart became even more fierce upon seeing this young woman being thrown into a panic by the inky flood dragon. If the tunnel was still intact like before, Han Li naturally would not be concerned with the survival of this martial ancestor of the masked Moon Sect. However, having seen the tunnel mysteriously disappear, this place had become a dangerous location, and Han Li's mentality naturally would be greatly different from before. In addition, he had heard the masked Moon Sect martial ancestor call out some small five-element Zumi forbidden technique with his own ears, as if she was very clear as to what had caused the disappearance of the tunnel. Thus, the hope of escaping from this place still had to lie with this woman. He knew nothing about forbidden techniques and the like, so this young female expert absolutely could not die right now. However, Han Li also refrained from moving rashly, fearing that the young woman would have some kind of lethal last resort. Thus, it wasn't until the young woman had exhausted her energy and threw out all kinds of talismans, reached her wit's end, and her face revealed an expression of hopelessness, that Han Li made a move to save this young woman. The young woman, apart from rejoicing at Han Li's sudden appearance, felt somewhat upset. She had seen, exceptionally clearly, Han Li's intention to allow the battle with the inky flood dragon to proceed to this point. However, no matter what, dealing with the increasingly ferocious inky flood dragon was the most pressing matter, so after the young woman had rested for a moment, she wordlessly began to coax her magic treasure to attack. When Han Li brushed with the inky flood dragon, he began to quietly complain. When he had been watching the young woman battle with this beast, he had not seen at all that this demonic beast was so strong. It wasn't until now, when he had personally taken the stage, that he experienced the inky flood dragon's terror. His gold beetle swarm mother blade could be considered to be a premium product even among top-grade magic tools, but when those streaks of golden light got close to the inky flood dragon, they were carelessly swatted away by its two claws and its tail, immediately flying backwards roughly 100 feet away. They had no strength to hold their own at all. Even if Han Li relied on quantity, using a few golden blades at one time was enough for one or two golden blades to stab the inky flood dragon's body as a fluke. But apart from leaving a white mark, there was no other effect, leaving Han Li completely silent. In addition, Han Li didn't dare to be sloppy against the inky flood dragon's attacks, not to mention allowing the opponent's claws or tail to come into contact with him. Han Li would even use the iron shield to block every drop of the black water that the opponent occasionally spit out. Just like that, this magic tool that had saved Han Li numerous times was also corroded by the unremarkable black water, forming many holes. One truly did not know how much longer it would be able to last. If the strength of this black water was already this frightening, wouldn't that even more ruthless purple liquid be even more unreasonable? No wonder those masked Moon Sect disciples had died so straightforwardly. Magic tools were of absolutely no use. The more Han Li fought with the inky flood dragon, the more apprehensive he became. He virtually completely relied on his movement techniques to dodge the demonic beast's fierce attacks. Those golden blades simply could not block the opponent at all. No wonder the young woman had told her sect's disciples to immediately leave this area. Apart from people with outstanding movement techniques like himself, Han Li really could not find many chi condensation disciples who could deal with this demonic beast even for one moment. It was at this time that the young woman's vermilion bird band came up, instantly decreasing the pressure on Han Li by a great amount. After all, this band magic treasure was still able to create some pain for the inky flood dragon, causing it to be somewhat wary of it. Little fellow, you hid there for so long. Why didn't you make a move earlier? If you had made a move earlier, perhaps I would still have an opportunity to inflict a heavy wound on this beast. The young woman asked resentfully as she controlled her magic treasure's attacks. I was worried you would kill me and steal my treasures. Han Li replied very obediently, instantly stifling the young woman from speaking for a while. Han Li was very clear that despite this woman's apparent youth, if one were to discuss her true age, she would definitely be old enough to act as his grandmother with some more to spare, so he should display less of his cleverness. It would be best for him to speak his thoughts frankly to allow both sides to ally with one another and fight the enemy instead of being a hindrance to each other. As for the other person's identity as a core formation expert and the discrepancy between his status and hers, Han Li purposefully feigned ignorance and ambiguously passed over it. At any rate, based on the other person's current power, she was still unable to control him. Han Li held no fear in his heart today for this young woman who had lost most of her magic power. "Young fellow, you have so many thoughts at such a tender age. I only fear you may not live for very long," said the young woman with a bitter tone after being low-spirited for a while. Hearing this, Han Li laughed once and did not make a retort. However, he quietly said in his heart, "If I had thought any less, I might have died many times already, not to mention in the future." Seeing that Han Li did not continue to speak, allowing her to say that much, the young woman lost some of the anger in her heart and began to consider a plan to deal with the enemy. "You have any way of inflicting a heavy wound on this flood dragon? If you do, quickly say it." The young woman, seeing that the two of them, even after forming an alliance with Han Li for a short while, were still being chased around everywhere in disarray with no spare room for retaliation, finally could not endure it and asked, "I do have one, but it requires for the opponent to be bound for a short amount of time. You cannot allow it to move." Han Li hurriedly replied as he used the iron shield to block another spitting attack by the inky flood dragon, while his figure leaped around incessantly, attempting to widen the distance between him and the inky flood dragon. "Okay, I'm going to use the last magic power I have. I can still bind it for a short moment. Hopefully it's enough for you to use, but is your method reliable?" The young woman's eyes lit up when she heard that, and she closely followed the flood dragon that was chasing after Han Li, using the vermilion bird band to fiercely bash the flood dragon's body before hurriedly saying, "I have a very powerful treasure talisman. It definitely can break through this flood dragon's defenses," Han Li said with full self-confidence. He did not believe that this demonic beast would still be able to block the full-force attack of the golden light brick. "Treasure talisman." When the young woman heard this, her heart was filled with joy. She had never expected that the yellow Maple Valley young man in front of her eyes actually could obtain such a rare item. Although she also had a few treasure talismans, their strength was not even on par with her vermilion bird band. Since the other person had so much self-confidence, it seemed like it should be a purely destructive treasure talisman. This was definitely an extremely rare object. Since she realized that Han Li's method was feasible, the young woman immediately stopped in midair, then started the incantation that had once bound the flood dragon before. The vermilion bird band securely wrapped around the demonic beast's body again, causing it to start struggling in anger. Han Li, seeing this golden opportunity, immediately placed the flying dark iron shield in front of his body. Then, he pulled out the golden light brick treasure talisman and sat down cross-legged. Under Han Li's control, the golden light brick treasure talisman manifested the magic treasure's material existence after a brief moment. A golden, foot-long brick floated into midair, light shining in all directions. The spiritual power inside of Han Li, like flooding river water, poured unstoppably into this brick. Not long after, 1/3 of his magic power had been sucked away. This caused the gold light above his head to become even more dazzling. One simply would not dare to look at it directly. While the young woman was using all her energy to enclose the inky flood dragon, she was closely watching Han Li's every movement. When she saw that gold brick emerge, she finally let go of her originally somewhat perturbed state of mind. She knew that Han Li did not lie, and that this treasure talisman really could break through the demonic beast's defenses. It seemed as if the inky flood dragon could also detect the discouraging turn of events. Its two claws tenaciously grabbed the two sides of the band, and its attempts to escape became even more violent. It actually caused the young woman's vermilion bird band to begin to tremble. This caused the young woman's expression to change, and she hastily shouted at Han Li, "Hurry up, it's about to escape." When Han Li heard this, he did not dare to hesitate and pointed his finger at the treasure talisman on his forehead. In an instant, the gold brick flew with a whiz towards the inky flood dragon, and halfway to its destination, it suddenly began to metamorphose drastically, becoming like a small mountain, ferociously smashing down at the inky flood dragon. The struggling inky flood dragon knew that the situation was far from good, but its two green eyes suddenly glinted ominously, and it opened its mouth, causing the purple liquid that Han Li was very afraid of to spurt out again. It blocked the falling golden brick perfectly, actually causing it to have no way of descending for a while. Seeing this, the young woman and Han Li were both surprised. Han Li had to focus on controlling the golden brick, so he could only stare helplessly at it, unable to do anything, but the young woman bit her apricot lips and pulled out a yellow pearl from her bosom. With a raise of her hand, she slammed it towards the demonic beast, which was in a deadlock with the golden brick. With a bang, the pearl slammed into the head region of the inky flood dragon and immediately burst open. Instantly, a small cloud of yellow fog shrouded the flood dragon's body, causing the inky flood dragon to begin to howl in panic. Naturally, the purple liquid that was being shot out also stopped. Without the purple liquid to block, the somewhat weakened tip of light from the golden brick descended at once, perfectly and solidly slamming onto the flood dragon's body. A huge, earth-shaking sound exploded out, and a dazzling gold light lit up the entire underground area in a flash, but it immediately became pitch black again, reverting to its normal state. Next, the golden brick that had returned to its original size turned again into a streak of gold light, flying to Han Li's side. Only the dying demonic beast was left in midair. Half of the inky flood dragon's head region had been smashed to a pulp, and a flood dragon eye had completely burst out of its socket, flying to an unknown location. The other eye naturally was still there, but it was also incessantly bleeding. The entire inky flood dragon seemed to be incredibly miserable. It seemed like this demonic beast was not far from dying. Seeing this, the young woman rejoiced in her heart and hurriedly pulled out a small crystal vase from her storage pouch, then muttered some words at the small vase. Then, she pointed at the inky flood dragon, and a few strands of black air came flying out of the lip of the vase, eerily wrapping around the inky flood dragon's body. Not long after, a small green flood dragon completely different from the previous inky flood dragon was forcibly shot out from within the inky flood dragon's body. Although it bared its fangs and brandished its claws, struggling fiercely, it was still slowly pulled into the small vase. When the young woman closed the vase, she closely assessed the miniature flood dragon inside of the few-eyes vase and was unable to conceal the smile on her face. Her entire person began to beam with joy. Then, she glanced at the corpse of the inky flood dragon closely again. It had already lost the odor of death. She began to ponder. Han Li, seeing the young woman's activity, immediately realized that she had collected the primordial spirit of that flood dragon. Although he didn't know what the inky flood dragon's primordial spirit could be used for, based on the young woman's elated reaction, he knew it was considerably valuable. At this time, the young woman reached out her hand and retrieved the vermilion bird band. The inky flood dragon's corpse immediately fell from midair, happening to land right in front of Han Li's eyes. Since I took this flood dragon's primordial spirit, its corpse can be left for you. After all, it was killed by the two of us, the young woman said calmly, flying and landing next to Han Li's side. When Han Li heard this, he glanced at the perfectly satisfied young woman, then lowered his head and looked at the fleshy body of the inky flood dragon. He said melancholically in his heart, "It's easy for you to say. Giving this corpse to me, perhaps it's because you reckon that I have no use for it. In addition, this inky flood dragon is as sturdy as a turtle's shell, and both you and I are very clear about this. It seems like you want to watch me make a fool out of myself." Thinking to this point, Han Li caused a cold light to flash across his hand, and a huge silver sword appeared in his hand. It was precisely the extremely strong magic tool from the barefooted man from earlier. Han Li wordlessly stabbed the huge sword with force. With a pache, this silver sword actually sank 3 inches into the inky flood dragon's corpse. Although it wasn't stabbed too far in, it had finally broken through the flood dragon's defenses, causing the young woman to the side's jaw to drop in astonishment, unable to close it for some time. Han Li, seeing the young woman's expression, found it to be laughable in his heart and continued to wave around this sword, about to stab down again. "Halt, let me see this sword," said the recovered young woman slowly, staring at that silver sword with a look of amazement, causing Han Li to become startled. "What is there to be afraid of? I'm a dignified core formation cultivator. What kind of treasures have I not seen before? It's just that this sword of yours is really somewhat strange, and I'm somewhat curious is all," snapped the young woman, seeing that Han Li was somewhat hesitant and rolled her eyes at him. Although the young woman's appearance was young, her charming, flirtatious gaze actually caused Han Li's heart to speed up, unable to control himself. "This sword really does have some problems. After I obtained it, I don't know why, but I have no way of controlling this sword. Otherwise, we would not have been in such tough straits when dealing with the inky flood dragon earlier." Since the young woman said so, Han Li could only force himself to hand over that sword to the young woman as he slowly explained. As of right now, he was still unwilling to fall out with the young woman. After all, based on her unhurried movements in the face of desperate circumstances, she should know how to get out of this place and should have a well-thought-out plan in her heart. And the young woman did not seem to be on guard against him. It seemed like she was somewhat clear about his thoughts, not afraid that he would attempt some kind of sneak attack. "Z's, sure enough, it's true. It really is too extravagant." The young woman sighed with regret after receiving the sword. After she had closely caressed it and identified it, her face revealed an expression of extortion. "What's the matter?" Han Li couldn't help but ask, seeing that the young woman had seemingly noticed something. "Nothing really. The reason why this silver sword is so sharp is only because silver essence was added into it, which is usually only used when refining magic treasures. In addition, its quantity is not small, more than enough to allow this item's quality to reach that of normal magic treasures," said the young woman indifferently, carelessly returning the sword to Han Li. "Silver essence," said Han Li, a bit surprised. "Even if I told you, you wouldn't understand. Only true fire from a core formation cultivator or above would be able to extract raw materials from magic treasures in large quantities from pure silver. It's extremely precious. My vermilion bird band also contains this kind of material," said the young woman somewhat impatiently. Hearing this, Han Li cursed again in his heart. "I asked you precisely because I didn't know. If I knew, would I need to ask?" Although he had clearly seen the young woman's unwillingness to speak any further, Han Li still turned a blind eye and continued to ask. "Why can other people use this sword to meet enemies, while I simply have no way to control it?" Seeing Han Li's manner of asking until the end, the young woman became somewhat unhappy in her heart, but she still replied indifferently. The original owner of this sword had used a heart-refining technique to refine it. This kind of method is extremely corrupt, so of course other people have no way of using it. Unless you were to melt down this sword and re-refine it, this sword can only be a useless object to other people. Han Li's expression was somewhat ugly. He originally had held very high hopes for this sword, but if what the other person said was true, his hopes would be completely dashed. "A useless object, I don't see it. Can I still use it now?" Han Li said coldly and abruptly after a few moments of silence. Then he began to control the silver sword in an unrestrained way, wildly stabbing at the flood dragon corpse. In the time it took to roll one's eyes, he had cut open the inky flood dragon. The young woman, seeing Han Li's extremely crude butchering appearance, couldn't help but knit her eyebrows and retreat a few steps, increasing her distance from Han Li. Then, she bleakly said, "Although this inky flood dragon had just entered Grade 2, its entire body is full of valuable raw materials. Flood dragon skin can be refined into good armor. Its sharp horns and claws are the most important raw materials in refining top-grade magic tools, and the remaining core liquid inside of it is also necessary to refine a few precious pills." Seemingly for no reason, the young woman explained everything clearly in great detail to Han Li, causing him to feel somewhat unsettled apart from being amazed. He didn't know what the other person's intentions were. What a pity! If this flood dragon had entered the 3rd grade, the flood dragon core within its forehead definitely could cause many core formation cultivators to fight furiously for it. Whether for refining pills or magic tools, it's incredibly useful, sighed the young woman regretfully all of a sudden. "Flood dragon core, what color is it? Is it this?" Han Li suddenly pulled out a red, fist-sized sphere from the flood dragon's midsection, holding it and mentioning it to the completely surprised young woman. "Yi, what is this? Did you retrieve it from the inky flood dragon's body?" The young woman, feeling this was something unanticipated, couldn't help but scoot closer to Han Li to take a close look at it. Really is somewhat similar. It's only that this inky flood dragon has obviously only just entered the 2nd grade and cannot possibly produce a flood dragon core. In addition, this inky flood dragon is a vial water attribute inky flood dragon, so its inner core should be blue. Let me touch it and see what it is. After gazing at it for some time, the young woman finally could not endure it anymore and took the soft, velvety sphere from Han Li's hand, stroking it a few times. But at this time, with a poo, the sphere actually burst open on its own for no reason, and a large cloud of red smoke immediately shrouded Han Li and the young woman within it. Han Li felt that he was having an incredibly marvelous, erotic dream. The person with him in the dream had a burning passion, but he could never clearly see the face of the peerless beauty. But even if the erotic dream were better, there would always be a time when he would wake up. After an unknown amount of time had passed, Han Li finally awoke from his glamorous dream. But as soon as he opened his eyes, what he saw was a gorgeous, peerless face and a pair of snow-like cold pupils. This beautiful face was both unfamiliar yet familiar at the same time, causing Han Li's heart to thump once. "You woke up," the young woman said indifferently with a voice no trace of emotion. This caused a slight chill to rise from Han Li's back when he heard it. Speaking of a chill, Han Li discovered that his entire naked body was tightly embracing a similarly naked beautiful woman. The woman's face was first crimson, but immediately her sleek eyebrows rose vertically, and her jade-like face frosted over. She coldly spat out, "Have you had enough? Take your dog paws off me and let me go." Started, Han Li instinctively retrieved both of his hands and released the woman. This great beauty, seeing that Han Li had let go, hurriedly used one hand to push herself off the ground. Her eye-catching, curved body immediately stood up from Han Li's chest. But just as the extremely beautiful young woman's slender waist had straightened, she yelled out, her flowery face losing its color with pain. Her body shook once, and then she fell again into Han Li's chest, causing Han Li to again experience the feeling of soft jade covering his torso. Han Li did not consider himself to be a base person, but he definitely did not consider himself to be a person with noble character. So when this beautiful woman had thrown herself into his arms, he regained his focus and immediately rode his hands up, pressing the woman up against his body. Then he gently kissed the woman's tender, alluring lips, causing the words that the woman had wanted to berate Han Li with to be forcibly shocked away. Underneath Han Li's hot kisses, her slender eyebrows slowly smoothed out, and she began to fall into a trance. What followed was a case of, when conditions are right, success will naturally follow. Han Li and the young woman wordlessly enjoyed the taste of ecstasy between a man and a woman once again. This, compared to the experience they had when the two of them were in a state of semi-consciousness, caused them to become even more intoxicated and made them even more crazy and forgetful. Today, the beautiful woman's two eyes were tightly pressed up against Han Li's chest, her two cheeks flushed red, her chest rising and falling indefinitely. Evidently, she had yet to awaken from the greatest stimulus. Han Li embraced this beautiful woman with one hand, and the other hand was incessantly fondling the woman's round and well-developed area with a desire to continue. After an unknown amount of time, the gorgeous woman's breathing finally stabilized, and her expression had finally returned to normal. She slowly opened her eyes. This time she didn't say a single sentence to Han Li, immediately pushing aside Han Li's mischief-causing hand from her body. She stood up with a bleak expression and walked towards a nearby storage pouch. Han Li slightly started, but after a moment of hesitation, he did not obstruct this woman. The young woman retrieved a set of snow-white garments from the storage pouch and gently put them on. Not too long afterwards, she finished getting dressed, causing her entire temperament to change in an instant. She began to appear graceful and poised. At this time, she turned her head around to glance at Han Li, then stared blankly for a moment. This was because Han Li had long since stood, neatly clothed, not too far behind her. He was currently gazing at her with an admiring and tender gaze, causing this woman's state of mind to stir. A trace of a strange feeling crept into her heart. "You should be very clear about what kind of person I am. The things that happened between us were only mistakes. Just pretend it was all a dream," the young woman said faintly, gently curling her sleek hair. "I know," Han Li answered peacefully after a moment of silence, rubbing his nose. "If a third person finds out what happened today, I will kill you," the young woman suddenly stated in a cold tone. "I will not breathe a word. If this matter travels to the outside world, you can just kill me," Han Li warmly responded with a faint smile. "HMPH, as long as you know." Seeing that Han Li agreed instantly, the woman did not actually feel happy in her heart. In fact, she began to feel somewhat vexed, and her tone became even more vile. After saying this, the woman and Han Li remained silent in a stalemate for some time. Neither of them uttered another sentence. Although the woman was a core formation cultivator, she had always spent her time cultivating as a child. As for the affairs between males and females, she was not much different from normal young women. Thus, although she had instinctively forced Han Li to not transmit this matter to the outside world, her thoughts were still in turmoil, unsure of how to face this matter. Han Li was not much better than the woman. He had never expected that his first intimate relationship with a woman would actually be with a female core formation cultivator. In addition, it was with this kind of a peerless talent and beautiful person, completely different from the sweet-tempered, pretty daughter from a humble family that he had imagined. This caused him to laugh bitterly. Would this one-night affair be a blessing or a curse to him? Regardless of what it would be, Han Li had already seen that the woman did not harbor the malevolent idea of killing him to silence him, causing him to let out a sigh of relief. Many favorable impressions spawned towards this great beauty with whom he had already experienced the affairs of a husband and wife. But these were only favorable impressions. If the other person still wanted to become hostile and make a move, Han Li decided that he would not resign himself to death. What exactly was that sphere? How could it cause you and me to? Han Li was the first to open his mouth, but after saying half of the sentence, he did not continue. However, he trusted that the other person would be able to understand his meaning. That was the inky flood dragon's prostate capsule. I didn't expect that this beast actually was a very rarely seen male flood dragon, and I actually carelessly forgot this matter. This capsule contains an aphrodisiacal fog. When it contacts any female, it will immediately erupt. So it was like that. Hearing this, Han Li was finally enlightened. The riddle in his heart was finally resolved. Then your current appearance, why is it different from before? Practice a sect-unique cultivation technique, the female essence incarnation technique. This magic technique, although somewhat strange, can allow a person to remain perpetually young. Every 10 years, this magic technique will cycle through once. My magic strength would have gone through the cycle, and I thus naturally would have restored my young appearance. But after what happened between us, this technique was temporarily broken and I slightly aged. The young woman explained casually after a moment of silence. Then you won't have any troubles, right? Han Li didn't know why he couldn't help but ask this question. It's not a problem. My magic technique is already at great success stage. Even if my virginity has been broken, I will only lose 5 to 6 years of magic power. This to me does not count for much, said the woman coldly, glancing at Han Li with a complicated expression. Hearing this, Han Li became silent. He knew that the other person's heart still contained a significant amount of resentment towards losing her virginity. He could only remain silent and face it. This woman truly felt that she had been extremely wronged. She had just then secretly sized up the other person a few times and had confirmed once again that this Yellow Maple Valley disciple was truly completely average, whether in terms of appearance or natural talent. And she had actually done things that should only be done between a husband and wife with this person. How could this not cause her, who had always been proud and arrogant, to feel incredibly dejected? But she was also somewhat reluctant of the idea of killing this person to relieve the hatred in her heart. After all, the other person was the male who had taken away her virginity, and she inevitably had a few strange feelings towards this person. This caused her to feel both anger and hatred. What time is it now? It shouldn't have passed the time limit of 5 days, right? Han Li couldn't help but ask after suddenly recalling something. Upon hearing this, the woman, whose state of mind was already unstable, felt an abrupt fright spring up in her heart, but immediately afterwards, she calmed down and said calmly, "It shouldn't have been that long. The sedative contained in the inky flood dragon's aphrodisiacal smoke should be very low in concentration. At most, we were unconscious for 5 to 6 hours. But if we want to leave, we also must make our preparations now. This dangerous area is not so easy to exit from," added the woman, knitting her eyebrows. "However, before all of that, you have no opinions on me taking this treasure chest, right?" inquired the young woman as she glanced coldly at Han Li, her almond lips opening slightly. Hearing this, Han Li bitterly laughed. Although at the moment he could not sense the depth of that woman's magic power, it was definitely above the foundation establishment stage. How could he dare to fight with her over the treasure chest? The woman, seeing that Han Li did not utter a word, coldly smiled and leaped towards the white jade pavilion. In the end, she very smoothly retrieved the golden chest into her storage pouch, then flew back to Han Li's side. Those spiritual medicines. Seeing that the woman had not harvested those spiritual medicines, Han Li stammered, somewhat baffled. "I have no need of them. If you like them, you can harvest them all." The woman glanced at Han Li and said without geniality after hearing this. Hearing these words, Han Li became very happy in his heart. He had just been worrying that, after exiting the forbidden area, he would not have enough spiritual medicines to turn into his sect and would seem suspicious to others. Thus, he unhesitatingly immediately flew over, and in the time it took to roll one's eyes, he retrieved tens of spiritual medicines. The woman stood in the same spot and coldly watched Han Li's movements without making a sound. Only after Han Li harvested the medicines and returned did she slowly and solemnly say, To break free from this place requires cooperation between the two of us. We cannot successfully leave this place if one of us is missing. Inside the large stone temple hall, the sound of rumbling continued to echo. The masked moon sect disciples were strenuously using magic tools, smashing open a large tunnel many meters deep. However, regardless of what magic tool stuck inside the stone tunnel, they could only pound away a chunk of rock about an inch wide. This caused everyone to become even more discouraged as they pounded away. After several hours, all of the disciples blankly sat on the ground and wordlessly looked at the large hole as if they were all lifeless. As of this moment, they had wanted to rescue their martial ancestor, but they didn't hold the slightest confidence in doing so. All of them started to think about the fearsome consequences of losing their martial ancestor and started to think of their path to escape. Right at this moment, a large sound came from outside the stone hall, and the earth rumbled for a moment more, as if there was a tremendous battle occurring outside. This caused the disciples to be faintly surprised. "What's going on?" A few disciples looked at each other in dismay. Two male disciples immediately exited the stone hall with quick steps to see what was happening. Martial ancestor. Soon, the sound of great rejoice came from the disciples outside the hall. Although these loud noises were clearly heard by disciples inside the stone hall, they could not help but look at each other in shock and immediately charged out like hornets from their nest. Over 30 meters away from the hall entrance, there was a large hole several meters wide. Nearby, there was a remarkably beautiful woman wearing fluttering white clothes. From her appearance, it truly seemed she was the young female martial ancestor. At this moment, the masked moon sect martial ancestor coldly looked at the distance with an expression of indifference, completely ignoring the two male disciples who were standing behind her. This immediately jolted the originally wildly happy disciples, as if cold water had been poured on their heads. Could it be this martial ancestor intends to investigate and stir up the restrictive formation? With this thought, all of the disciples could not help but look at the two dainty female disciples at the center, causing these women's complexion to become deathly white and tremble with fear. After the white-clothed woman fully surveyed the area for a quarter of an hour, she slowly turned her head to look at the many disciples behind her. She coldly ordered, "Set off." They. Just as Han Li was flying from tree to tree with a body as agile as a monkey, he hurried off the mountain with a speed not inferior to the imperial flight technique. Currently, his body was surging with spiritual power. His body actually contained magic power of the 13th layer. Han Li felt a bit infatuated with this fantastic feeling of greatly increased magic power. However, he was unable to persistently release this great amount of spiritual power for a long period of time. He estimated that there were still several hours left before this disappeared. In order to leave the underground swamp, that woman had reason to cooperate with him and used some kind of secret magic to temporarily send a portion of the restriction spell's magic power to Han Li, causing Han Li's originally 11th layer power to ascend to the peak of chi condensation. The two then used the vermilion bird band and the golden light brick treasure talisman to forcibly break open a tunnel from underground to the surface. During these course of events, whenever Han Li's magic power was exhausted, the woman silently transmitted more magic power toward Han Li. As a result, when the two were able to leave from underground, Han Li had completely exhausted the golden light brick treasure talisman and turned it to waste paper, whereas the young woman had used up 20 to 30 years of cultivated power. These losses couldn't be considered anything but disastrous. With this said, the woman's female essence incarnation technique was truly strange. Within the incarnation cycle, she was able to transmit the restrictive spell's magic power to another male, but was unable to remove the restriction off herself and pass it on to a female. Furthermore, the magic power that could be transmitted was limited to the cultivation of the male. As Han Li was only at chi condensation, the amount of magic power he could contain was the 13th layer of his foundation cultivation technique. It was impossible for him to enter the realm of foundation establishment. Because Han Li had just received magic power from the woman prior to breaking their way to the surface and separating, he still had the magic power of 13th layer cultivation for the moment, allowing him to experience this wondrous sensation a while longer. Nanggong 1. In his heart, Han Li softly said this. Just as Han Li was about to depart from the woman, he asked for her name. However, when Han Li thought of how the woman begrudgingly told him, he grew a bit sad. He clearly understood without saying that he was a chi condensation disciple. Even if he were to enter foundation establishment, it would be impossible for them to have any sort of relationship. After all, their positions in the cultivation world and their lifespans were truly as different as heaven and earth. As a result, he could only bitterly accept the woman's heartlessness during their departure. And Lee understood himself well. He knew that if he entered Foundation establishment he would have a slight chance, but currently he could only look upward to her. With the great size of Yellow Maple Valley, there were over 10,000 cultivators, but only a trifling few were able to reach core formation. Han Li, knowing that his aptitude was lacking, didn't even have the slightest of confidence. Just as Han Li was thinking this, his expression suddenly grew dark. Whoosh! His body suddenly disappeared into the air. A few moments later, however, his body appeared where he originally was, but now he was holding a storage pouch. At this time, the headless corpse of a spirit beast mountain disciple fell off a nearby large tree. Han Li lightly swept through the things inside the storage pouch and lightly shook his head. He then leaped and departed. The afternoon of the 5th day after the forbidden area was opened, the many individuals from various sects waiting outside the forbidden area for quite a long time finally moved. The 7 core formation cultivators strenuously opened the entrance once again. They then looked at the dark passage, waiting for the first of ones to appear with serene expressions. It was very clear that breaking the magic barrier was far easier than it was 5 days ago. Furthermore, when the passage appeared, the 7 core formation experts put away their magic treasures, but the passage actually didn't disappear, maintaining a steady connection to the forbidden area. Behind the 7, there were several tens of Foundation establishment leaders with somewhat nervous expressions. This was related to the next distribution of Foundation establishment pills, so this event was quite important to these stewards. As for the Masked Moon Sect's senior eccentric Qiang, it was unknown when he appeared on the large rock nearby, but he was watching the several people with glee. When he saw those he made a bet with, his gaze became rather peculiar. After half an hour after the passage opened, a middle-aged Taoist priest with a calm expression walked out. His clothes were lined with ash and dirt and had several notable holes and bloodstains. It seemed that he had left the forbidden area after fighting a bitter battle. After the middle-aged Taoist priest appeared, he saluted the clear void sex core formation cultivator and quietly sat down cross-legged to the side. When the core formation cultivator saw this, he looked at the middle-aged Taoist priest with a smile and lightly nodded his head repeatedly. Martial Ancestor Li's expression was peaceful, without the slightest of emotion, but senior eccentric Qiang rolled his eyes and gave a dissatisfied snort. The next to walk out from the passage were a feminine man from Saber Transformation Dock, Zhang Wu, the ugly man from Spirit Beast Mountain, a blue-clothed youth from Heavenly Imperial Fortress, and Yellow Maple Valley's Chen siblings, along with other disciples. All of them more or less had traces of injury. Every one of them walked to their sect elder's location with expressions of exhaustion and sat down cross-legged to rest. After the time it took to eat a meal, another large batch of disciples walked out. This group of people were different from the loners who had previously emerged. They were all in groups of 2s and 3s. Furthermore, every person's face had greatly varying expressions. There were those who were greatly joyful, those who were completely dispirited, and those who had an expression of great relief. Adding this group of people to the several that arrived before, more than 20 of the 7 sects disciples had already returned. However, they still didn't see a single person from the Masked Moon Sect. This caused the other 6 sects to wear an expression of astonishment. However, senior eccentric Qiang's expression along with Celestial Nichang and the rest of those from the Masked Moon Sect did not change in the slightest, as if they had a card up their sleeve. After another hour passed by, aside from 2 disciples who appeared, there were no other traces of those from the Masked Moon Sect. There were still only 2 hours left before the passage closed. At this moment, senior eccentric Qiang and Celestial Nichang glanced at each other, slightly revealing an expression of unease. The appearance of a person suddenly flashed at the passage entrance. A youth from Yellow Maple Valley appeared. This person had a common appearance with neat clothes and hurried on his way, having the appearance of an unstoppable thunderbolt killing several people in succession. This person was Han Li. When the Masked Moon Sect members saw the image of a person at the passage entrance, their faces wore an expression of joy. But when they clearly saw that it was someone from Yellow Maple Valley, they immediately became greatly disappointed. At this moment, Han Li took a look at the surrounding situation and slowly walked to his sect's position. He copied the others and sat in formation. Coincidentally, he happened to sit next to the Chen siblings. It appeared that compared to the other 6 sects, Yellow Maple Valley disciples numbered the greatest among those who left the forbidden area alive. Apart from brother and sister Chen, there were also the old man as well as the youth. With the addition of Han Li, there were actually 5. Compared to the 3 to 4 survivors from the other sects, especially the trifling 2 from the giant sword sect, it could be considered much greater in number. This caused martial ancestor Li to be unable to conceal the joy in his heart as he wore a spring wind on his face. When the Chen siblings and the other 2 saw that Han Li, an 11th layer disciple, was actually able to leave the forbidden area completely intact and without injury, they could not help but show an expression of amazement. However, as if they immediately thought of something, they looked at Han Li with a gaze of contempt and did not pay further attention to him. Obviously, they all believed that Han Li was a coward, concealing himself and hiding from battle. He certainly harvested nothing. As the time for the passage to close grew closer, those from masked moon sect appeared one by one. This caused senior eccentric Qiang and celestial Nai Chang to be unable to sit still with an expression of unmistakable worry on their faces. This caused martial ancestor Li and the Taoist priest at the side to become secretly delighted. It seemed the masked moon sect truly had a mishap. Han Li, who saw all of this, wrinkled his brow and felt a bit of surprise. He definitely escaped from the underground swamp with Nangong Wan. Why did the others from the masked moon sect not yet appear? He could not help but be a bit worried about that woman. Chapter 210, The Gamble. Han Li suddenly thought of the other young woman that he had encountered inside the forbidden area and couldn't help but glance in the direction of Spirit Beast Mountain. In the end, he discovered that Han Yunjai was cutely sitting cross-legged on the ground, her expression very even. There did not seem to be anything unexpected, causing Han Li to let out a sigh of relief. Near the closed tunnel entrance, those from the masked moon sect appeared increasingly unsightly from worry. As for the people from the other sects, although they outwardly appeared to be anxious for the masked moon sect disciples, flower of happiness had contrarily bloomed in their hearts. After all, the masked moon sect was State of UA's strongest sect and had long attracted the jealousy of others. These few were naturally happy to see an opportunity to weaken its power. Perhaps because their wishes had gone awry, the opposite of their desires occurred. When the passageway was only a quarter-hour away from closing, a white shadow flashed within the passageway, and a group of 10 or so masked moon sect disciples walked out in an orderly fashion. Their leader was the extremely alluring beauty Nangong. Seeing them walk out, the senior eccentric Qiang's reaction was acceptable, only letting out a long sigh. That celestial Nai Chang couldn't help but pounce at her, tugging on the arm of the beautiful celestial Nangong. She began to ask her questions with extreme concern, her face revealing an expression of anxiety. The other sects felt puzzled upon seeing this. This was no surprise. Although Nangong Wan had met with these core formation cultivators several times, she had worn a veil and never revealed her true appearance. Thus, these people did not actually know that the beautiful, flowery young woman before them was actually the celestial Nangong that they had met with numerous times. Seeing this woman had safely returned, Han Li was also very pleased. After all, she was the first person he had joined bodies with. Even if he clearly knew that there was no way to continue their relationship, in his heart he still couldn't help but worry about her. However, the smiles on martial ancestor Li and the Taoist priest's face had become somewhat forced. This was not unexpected. Ignoring how many spiritual medicines the masked moon sect had harvested, even the number of people that had walked out of forbidden area alive had surpassed the combined numbers of the people from their 2 sects. How could this not cause the 2 of them to be extremely depressed? All of the disciples should have emerged by now. The ones who didn't appear, muttered the leader of the Spirit Beast Mountain, clearing his throat. But before he had finished his sentence, a person came scrambling out of the tunnel that was just about to close. It was actually that old, crafty Xianxia from Yellow Maple Valley. Only, the giant sword sect and the young Taoist priest originally harvesting the spiritual medicines with him had disappeared without a trace. The old man had just crawled out of the passageway when thunderous vibrations came from the direction of the forbidden area. Next, an azure light flashed, and the passageway fragmented, finally disappearing completely. At this time, even if there were still people inside the forbidden area who had yet to come out, it would only be a dead end for them. This was because any disciple who had not exited in time in the past never appeared again, even at the next opening of the forbidden area. They had all disappeared for an unclear reason, and this was also the reason why other people were not willing to waste time. However, the fact that this old, crafty Yellow Maple Valley 10th layer cultivator could actually escape at the very end was truly beyond expectation. They couldn't help but size up Xianxia. Brother Li, I didn't expect that your esteemed valley actually had so many talents. Not only 11th layer cultivators could walk out of the forbidden area, even 10th layer strength disciples can preserve their lives and exit. Your esteemed sect truly uses the correct method of teaching your disciples. I am truly in admiration. Seeing that only 2 people from his sect had left the forbidden area, and that the barefooted male whom he had high hopes for had not come out, while 2 low-level disciples from the Yellow Maple Valley had come out and preserved their own small lives, the cultivator from the Giant Sword sect couldn't help but feel his anger rise. He said these 2 sentences mockingly. When martial ancestor Li heard this, his face fell. He also reckoned that Han Li and Xianxia had both stayed in hiding and did not reveal themselves, wanting to seize any opportunity available. He could not help but bitterly glare at the old, crafty man, but he still had no choice but to protect the 2 of them with his words. The cultivation technique of these juniors is too superficial. Being able to preserve their own lives can also be considered to be their own good fortune. As for what method they used, the others and I, as their senior generation, have no need to add on any blame. HMPH. The Giant Sword sect expert, seeing martial ancestor Li put on such an act, found it extremely objectionable and wanted to say something else. However, senior eccentric Qiang opened his mouth, somewhat impatiently. What is there for you 2 to argue about? Since the person could survive, this is the skill of the junior generation. Do you want them to stubbornly charge forwards even if they clearly know it is impossible? However, little fellow Li, quickly examine the results of the bet. The earlier we know, the earlier our hearts will be at ease. Do you want the elderly me to wait here for even longer? This old man was clearly taking advantage of his age, but martial ancestor Li and the man from the Giant Sword sect actually really did not dare to make this person unhappy. They could only glance at each other before laughing the matter off. Otherwise, if this old freak started holding a grudge against them, they would have some really bad luck. Thus, under senior eccentric Qiang's urging, Fu Yunzi of the Clear Void sect and martial ancestor Li could only pinch their noses and move closer to him. Then, each of the disciples from the 3 sects that had come out of the forbidden area individually displayed the harvest that they had in order to determine the winner and loser of the bet. The Clear Void sect's Taoist priests who had walked out from the forbidden area were only 4 in number. However, when the middle-aged Taoist priest that had been the first to walk out of the forbidden area brought out his spiritual medicines, the faces of all the people present changed slightly. Fully mature 300-year-old blood blue pearls, 2 300-year-old sky spirit fruits, 3 400-year-old chalcedony mushrooms. The Taoist priest brought out 11 or 12 spiritual medicines in a row, individually placing them on the ground. The quantity was extremely high, greatly astonishing the surrounding people. Only Fu Yunzi, who had made the bet, was lightly smiling with content, as if he was very satisfied by the stunned looks of the others. Not only that, the spiritual medicines that the elders from Yellow Maple Valley and the male masked moon sect disciples had placed earlier were far less, each person merely placing a few herbs. Next, the harvest of the second Taoist priest was finally not as excessive, but there were still 7 or 8 spiritual medicines, significantly greater than harvests under normal circumstances. This caused martial ancestor to begin to feel unsettled, and senior eccentric Qiang's look of laughter was also retrieved. He became serious for the first time. Hearing of the matter concerning the bet, the experts from the other 4 sects naturally became interested and individually came forward to take a look. When they saw this scene, they also quietly considered it amazing. However, the spiritual medicines of the Chen clan brother and sister pair after them finally allowed martial ancestor Li to be somewhat delighted, since their combined harvest neared 20 herbs, already roughly the same as those 2 Taoist priests. The next Clear Void sect disciples' harvest was finally normal, only 4 herbs. As for the masked moon sect disciples, they maintained an average quantity. 3 people in a row had 5 or under herbs, causing the Taoist priest and martial ancestor Li to quietly sigh in relief. However, the next youth from Yellow Maple Valley to place his spiritual medicines delayed for a few moments. With great shame, he only pulled out 3 spiritual medicines. This caused martial ancestor Li to become so angry that his nose almost became crooked. He almost opened his mouth to berate him. This was because he did not have any belief that Han Li or the crafty old man could contribute much. According to sequence, it should have been Han Li's turn to go forwards, but who knew that crafty Xiang with a stride would grab the place in front of Han Li, respectfully pulling out 2 purple monkey flowers. This caused martial ancestor Li to feel great surprise, and his expression instantly became somewhat more pleasant. However, it was merely somewhat more. Although he had one or two more spiritual medicines than the clear void sect in front of him, as long as the other side's last individual could bring out a normal amount of spiritual medicines, he would definitely lose. He had absolutely no hope that Han Li's harvest would be too large, reckoning that Han Li at most would be like the crafty old man. Throwing 2 or 3 spiritual medicines would already be not too bad, and it could be considered the due diligence of these lower-level disciples. Thinking to this point, martial ancestor Li couldn't help but glance at Fu Yunzi, only to see the other person's restless appearance. He was also currently glancing at him. The two of them slightly started, then immediately averted their gazes, continuing to closely follow the gambling game. The last Taoist priest to step forward was a white-haired elderly man. When he walked to the front, he calmly brought out one herb after another. His slow, dilly-dallying manner caused all of the people to continuously roll their eyes. However, when he had pulled out 5 spiritual medicines in a row and was still reaching into his storage pouch, martial ancestor Li's expression instantly sank, while Fu Yunzi began to beam with joy. As for the masked moon sect disciples, those two people were unable to endure anymore and walked over, expressing their interest. Greatly beyond any expectations, this last white-haired Taoist priest actually pulled out 7 spiritual medicines in a row, causing all of the onlookers to feel greatly surprised. When martial ancestor Li saw this, his expression had already become incredibly ashen, while the Taoist priest excitedly turned his attention to the other masked moon sect disciples, reckoning that his victory over the Yellow Maple Valley was already secure. At this time, Han Li stepped forward. Other people only indifferently glanced at him before returning their gazes to the masked moon sect, completely ignoring him. Martial ancestor Li also saw this scene, but he similarly did not glance at Han Li at all, reckoning that he had already lost his opportunity to make a comeback. This 11th layer disciple's appearance would only be to make a fool of himself. Thus, he naturally would not give Han Li any face. Han Li did not pay attention to the movements of other people, and even more didn't have the idea of saving some ripe spiritual medicines and bringing out less. This was because each sect's ranks contained 2 other stewards, who had 1 or 2 smelling spiritual beasts by their sides. These kinds of squirrel-like strange beasts could smell out any hidden 100-year-old or above spiritual medicines from a distance of 30 feet. Even if they were inside a storage pouch, they could not escape notice. Thus, every disciple that exited the forbidden area, after voluntarily turning in all of their spiritual medicines, also had to be smelled by these small beasts once over before being allowed to leave. This was to prevent against disciples with malicious plans to smuggle a secret stash of spiritual medicines. Arriving at the location, Han Li held a storage pouch in his hand that he had prepared a long time ago. Then, he rudely flipped his hand, dropping it on the table. After a burst of white light, a huge pile of roughly 20 or so multicolored spiritual medicines formed a huge pile on the ground. Chapter 211, The Winner. Quick, look over there. This is... I don't dare to believe it. When this pile of spiritual medicines suddenly appeared on the ground, a few sharp-eyed individuals began to cry out in surprise. These few yells immediately attracted the gazes of other people. Of course, martial ancestor Li and Fu Yunzi were included in this group. However, when the two people saw clearly the spiritual medicines at Han Li's feet, the Taoist priest's grin immediately froze, while martial ancestor Li, after staring blankly for a moment, began to laugh loudly with pleasant surprise. This big pie that fell from the sky caused his heart to burst with joy. After martial ancestor Li had realized his own loss of self-control and stopped laughing, he stared at Han Li with a beaming gaze, assessing him constantly. How come when he looked at Han Li, he felt that Han Li was very pleasing? On the other hand, the Taoist priest's face had become ashen, still unable to believe that he had lost just like that. Naturally, his gaze towards Han Li held great unhappiness. Taoist brother, this is done. Do you still want to trouble a member of the junior generation? Martial ancestor Li humphed after glancing at Fu Yunzi's expression. He took a stride and blocked in front of Han Li, saying this with a straight face. Today, Han Li had just helped him with a great service. He naturally could not allow this member of the junior generation to be frightened by Fu Yunzi in front of this many people. Otherwise, his face would be entirely gone. The Taoist priest, being scolded by martial ancestor Li like this, realized that given his own identity, glaring at a chi condensation disciple in this way was incredibly wrong. Other people would mistakenly believe he was trying to secretly retaliate against a member of the junior generation, so he hurriedly averted his gaze towards martial ancestor Li and forced a laugh. Martial ancestor Li, it's a misunderstanding. This Taoist priest was only thinking that based on this young man's cultivation base, it is truly inconceivable that he would be able to harvest so many spiritual medicines. I was only taking a few extra glances at him. The Taoist priest made a huge effort to put on a nonchalant appearance, but as soon as he thought about that flood dragon inner Dan, he felt his heart bleed incessantly, and his expression had no way of returning to normal. Martial ancestor Li coldly laughed twice and noncommittally did not continue to speak. After all, he had achieved a great victory in today's bet and was unwilling to continue to provoke the other person. However, he was also somewhat suspicious of Han Li's ability to obtain so many spiritual medicines, but in front of so many people from other sects, martial ancestor Li was unwilling to interrogate Han Li now and could only turn a blind eye to it. Not to mention, at this moment his heart was on fire. As long as he could triumph again over the masked moon sect people, he really would have made it big on this expedition to the forbidden area. Naturally, he could not deal with these trivial matters. As long as he could win this gambling game, he couldn't care less about what stealing methods Han Li used to get the spiritual medicines. The Taoist priest, seeing martial ancestor Li's appearance, naturally realized the other person's thoughts. Could he, as the eliminated participant, only continue to observe who won between senior eccentric Qiang and the other person with an angry heartache? But senior eccentric Qiang's expression was not much better than that of the Taoist priest. The spiritual medicines that the few masked moon sect disciples had turned in were all common, truly causing him to be unable to laugh. Just as martial ancestor Li was in high spirits, the situation suddenly took a rapid turn. The quantities of spiritual medicines that the last few masked moon sect disciple turned in suddenly all reached 10 or so in number, in an instant surpassing even the sum of the Yellow Maple Valleys and Clear Void sects harvest by 5 or 6 herbs, winning the last round of the bet. This turn of events immediately knocked martial ancestor Li into a stupor, while senior eccentric Qiang let out a long sigh of relief and began to laugh strangely. Bring it, turn over that demonic flood d'Argon inner Dan. I was just wanting to refine a furnace of good pills, and this inner Dan is the best medicinal catalyst. Senior eccentric Qiang impolitely demanded his betting spoils from Fu Yunzi on the spot. Upon hearing this, the Taoist priest Fu Yunzi forced a smile and opened his mouth, as if he wanted to say something, but nothing came out of his mouth. Seeing this, senior eccentric Qiang glared unhappily. What, the well-renowned Clear Void sect's Fu Yunzi, could it be that you want to renege on this debt? Renege on this debt? Do I dare to renege on a debt with senior eccentric Qiang? Fu Yunzi naturally did not really mean to renege on the inner Dan. It was only that the loss of this kind of precious item hurt him greatly, and he was instinctively reluctant to part with it. But today, now that senior eccentric Qiang said it like that, his face alternated between red and white. After fiercely stomping his foot, he tossed a white sphere to the other person, then turned away with an expression of physical pain written on his face, unwilling to look. That sphere was the inner Dan of a demonic flood dragon. Senior eccentric Qiang grabbed the inner Dan with a raise of his hand. After closely inspecting it, he beamed with joy, but he still muttered. It seems that its quality is not too good, and its spiritual chi is not really sufficient. It looks like it's just passable. I'll have to make do with it. This sentence caused the Taoist priest's face to turn red when he heard it. He almost vomited blood and died with anger, and he hurriedly departed from this individual to a faraway place, lest his Tao heart die from depression. Taoist friend Li will send representative with 2 chunks of iron essence within 20 years. It's still Taoist friend Li that is straightforward. I have nothing else to say. Senior eccentric Qiang nodded his head with satisfaction, then returned to the masked moon sect side, very pleased with himself. This round of gambling had many twists and turns, truly causing the various bystanders from different sects to feel very amazed. In the end, seeing martial ancestor Li and Fu Yunzi's attempts to try to steal a chicken only to end up losing the rice used to lure it, everyone gloated. Who told them to gamble with this senior eccentric Qiang anyways? No matter what, this time's expedition to the forbidden area had ended. The leaders of the various sects, having received all of their own disciples, spiritual medicines, and letting them be checked by the spiritual beasts once, all said their goodbyes one by one and left, bringing their followers with them. Those from the masked moon sect were the first to leave, and so after they had said goodbye and stepped onto the heavenly moon divine boat one after the other, Han Li couldn't help but glance at the celestial Nangong in their midst. However, that woman, from boarding the boat to its eventual departure, never did glance back at him, causing Han Li to feel wronged in his heart. However, Han Li could also be considered a person with a strong state of mind, and in no time he had recovered to normal and continued to watch the other sects leave. When she was leaving with the Spirit Beast Mountain disciples, Han Yunjai glanced at Han Li and gave him a benevolent smile. This actually caused Han Li to feel somewhat warm in his heart. Yellow Maple Valley, as the host of the Forbidden Area, naturally would have to be the last to leave. Thus, when the other 6 sects all left, only the Yellow Maple Valley sect remained all alone outside of the Forbidden Area. However, Martial Ancestor Li didn't just take his followers and leave. Instead, he raised his head and gazed in the direction of the Forbidden Area silently. However, all the other people knew that this martial ancestor, having just lost a bet, could not be happy in his heart. Thus, nobody ignorantly went up to urge him on. They could only stand and watch behind him. After half a day, Martial Ancestor's mood seemed to be somewhat better. Although he did not turn around, he finally opened his mouth. His first sentence was directed at Han Li. The disciple that turned in the most spiritual medicines. What is your name, and how many years has it been since you entered the valley? When the other people heard this, they couldn't help but reveal an expression of envy. To have one's name known by this high-ranking martial ancestor meant that in the future one would definitely have great benefits. Han Li started slightly, and not daring to delay, immediately said with respect. Named Han Li, this disciple entered the valley nearly 3 years ago. Han Li. Martial Ancestor Li slowly repeated Han Li's name, as if he were considering something. He didn't actually reply immediately. Instead, he caused all the people behind him to turn and look at each other. They didn't know what this Martial Ancestor Elder's intention was, but Martial Ancestor Li's next sentence caused Han Li's heart to shiver, and he raised 120% of his attention. Han Li, tell me the process that you went through to obtain these spiritual medicines. I want to hear it, asked Martial Ancestor Li, seemingly arbitrarily. Although Han Li was alert in his heart, he had long before made preparations for being interrogated by others concerning this matter. Thus, he was not panicked. He calmly said, Yes, Martial Ancestor. This matter is actually very much due to fluke. On that day, although Disciple had hidden in the ring-shaped mountain, regrettably no real rewards were to be had. However, on the afternoon on the 4th day, Disciple actually found 2 people fighting over a few sprigs of chalcedony within a very remote cave. One was the barefooted, silver sword-carrying giant sword sect disciple, and the other was a heavenly imperial fortress person with scars covering his face. Disciple thus secretly hid in. Just like that, Han Li vividly began to describe a tale of taking advantage of the 2 people's conflict. In addition, he did his best to exaggerate his unexpected luck, causing the Chen brother and sister, as well as the other disciples, to feel incredibly jealous, their envious intent extremely apparent. Martial Ancestor Li, upon hearing Han Li's account, silently nodded his head, feeling that only in this way could it possibly happen. Otherwise, how could a disciple with a low cultivation technique like Han Li possibly harvest so many spiritual medicines? It seemed like the other person truly was incredibly lucky, and that it had been a complete coincidence. Believing that he had figured out the story behind this matter, Martial Ancestor Li did not want to continue wasting time interrogating. However, after pausing for a while, he suddenly said to Han Li with a solemn expression, Han Li, your services towards the sect this time were not small. Although I did not win the bet, I must still reward you greatly. I plan to receive you under my tutelage, and you can be one of my few disciples. Are you willing? Hearing this, Han Li instantly froze and didn't know how to respond for some time. And when the other Yellow Maple Valley people heard this, they first received a great shock, then tenaciously glared at Han Li, revealing an expression of disbelief. This was too inconceivable. They hadn't heard wrong, had they? This martial ancestor elder would actually receive this person as a disciple so easily. This person, whether discussing qualifications or cultivation technique, was extremely average. One could truly not tell if this person had any qualities that stood out, allowing him to be noticed by Martial Ancestor Li. Chapter 212, A Sudden Understanding. Chapter 212, A Sudden Understanding. Normally, a lower-layer cultivator being accepted by a core formation cultivator as a disciple would definitely be an extremely bizarre matter, a situation that one could not even dream about. However, when Han Li was in shock after he heard these words, he instinctively detected that something was not right. Based on his aptitude and magic technique, how could this kind of a good fortune fall upon his shoulders? As for the explanation that it was a great reward for his supposed great services to Yellow Maple Valley, Han Li believed it even less. If this martial ancestor had won the bet, and in a moment of excitement accepted him because of this success, it might have actually been somewhat sincere. But even though he had clearly lost in a total mess, he still wanted to accept him as a disciple. This was enough to make Han Li think. While Han Li was running through all these mental gymnastics, martial ancestor Li began to become displeased. When he had said that he would accept Han Li as his disciple, he originally thought that the other person would definitely be incomparably ecstatic and immediately agree readily. But who expected that Han Li actually stood blankly in the same spot, his expression one of amazement. He actually didn't immediately respond, which caused martial ancestor Li to feel somewhat resentful. However, on the outside, martial ancestor Li naturally still had to maintain the poise of a martial ancestor, so he indifferently said, Han Li, if you aren't willing to take me as your master, you only need to clearly say it. I will not force you. I can separately bestow a few magic tools upon you as compensation. When Han Li heard this, he knew that although the other person's words were pretty, he definitely was not happy in his heart. Han Li was very clear even without thinking hard what the consequences of offending this martial ancestor would be. In addition, for a chi condensation disciple like him to refuse a core formation cultivator's acceptance of a disciple excessively defied common sense. Perhaps after he refused the offer, he would attract even more troubles. Thinking to this point, he gritted his teeth. No matter what the other person's attempts towards him were, he would first deal with the situation in front of him. Disciple is obviously delighted to be able to kowtow under martial ancestor's tutelage. It is this disciple's honor. Earlier it was just that disciple was too happy and completely forgot to speak. Please forgive disciple, martial ancestor, Han Li said with a hurried tone, his face blushing strongly as he pretended to regain his focus after being exhilarated. Then Han Li very tactfully kowtowed a few times to martial ancestor Li, immediately performing the ritual of formally becoming a disciple. Very good. From today onwards you are my, Li Huayuan's disciple. This jade lightsaber magic tool can be regarded as a greeting present. A smiling, exuberant expression appeared on Li Huayuan's face, and he reached his hand out to support Han Li. Then he handed him a long, greenish jade saber. Judging from the spiritual light flickering on it, it definitely was a top-grade magic tool. Han Li solemnly received the long saber with his two hands, then kowtowed again to express his respect before standing up again, pretending to be unable to contain his joy. The other disciples watched dumbstruck, fires burning in their eyes. Their gazes towards Han Li were extremely peculiar, wishing that the person to receive the magic tool was themselves instead of Han Li, whom they had long considered to be unpleasant to their sight. Although Han Li was unclear about the thoughts inside other people's hearts, the provocative gazes individually landing on his body allowed him to roughly guess it, and he couldn't help but bitterly laugh in his heart. If it was possible, he actually hoped that the attention of this martial ancestor could have been placed on another person instead of himself, an unlucky bastard. One had to know that he still remembered very clearly the lesson he had learned from his previous master, Dr. Mo. Even better, today another master with even greater ability and many schemes had come. This caused Han Li to be speechless. When after a period of time your foundation establishment succeeds, I will come take you to my place personally and receive you as an official disciple. It doesn't matter if your foundation establishment has not yet occurred. I will also give you some pointers on your cultivation technique, martial ancestor Li instructed Han Li. Yes, master. Han Li, naturally having no more opinions, very obediently complied. Okay, the time is not early. Let's return to Yellow Maple Valley, declared martial ancestor Li after glancing at the color of the sky. Next, everybody once again climbed onto martial ancestor Li's silver python, and after a few days of flight, returned to Yellow Maple Valley. As soon as they had entered the valley, martial ancestor Li Huayuan brought two stewards with him and went ahead to the official hall. The other people dissipated one by one, returning to their own homes, awaiting the prizes that would be awarded a few days later. Within a small cottage in the Yellow Maple Valley's 100 Medicine Garden, The little senior martial uncle Ma opened his eyes wide, staring at Han Li as if he had seen a ghost. He muttered in his mouth nonstop. This is impossible. Not only did you not die, you also picked up a fortune in the forbidden area, turning in 20 or so spiritual medicines in an instant, and you were accepted by martial ancestor Li as an in-name disciple. Yes, senior martial uncle Ma, isn't my good fortune deep and my good luck stunning? Han Li said, smiling yet not smiling, as he sat opposite the little old man as if he were very pleased. The little old man's facial expression returned to normal upon hearing Han Li's words, but he began to gaze at Han Li with a strange expression in his eyes. His gaze caused Han Li to feel somewhat apprehensive, unsure of what the other person's intentions were. Little fellow Han, your harvest from this time's expedition to the forbidden area truly is not small. It has far exceeded all of my expectations, said the little old man with a long sigh. I also did not expect it, Han Li leisurely responded. But do you know the real purpose for why Junior Martial Uncle Li accepted you as an in-name disciple? TL. The change in Martial Ancestor Li's title here is mostly due to Senior Martial Uncle Ma's seniority and status as compared to Martial Ancestor Li. The somewhat sympathetic tone revealed in the little old man's next sentence caused Han Li to jolt, but immediately after he began to rejoice. However, he was still strongly resisting the movements in his heart. He pretended to be confused and asked in astonishment. Senior Martial Uncle Ma, could it be that Martial Ancestor Li's accepting of disciples has another reason? Senior Martial Uncle, he. Since Junior Martial Brother Han Li has already kowtowed to Junior Martial Uncle, you can just call me Senior Martial Brother Ma. I no longer dare to respond to the title Senior Martial Uncle, said the little old man slowly and methodically, gently shaking his head. Cough. Why does Senior Martial Uncle Ma laugh at Junior Martial Nephew, who doesn't know that seniority in the cultivation world is assigned by cultivation technique? As long as I have not yet entered the foundation establishment stage for one day, Senior Martial Uncle Ma is naturally still my senior, said Han Li very sincerely, and immediately poured a cup of medicine flower tea for the little old man, handing it to the other person. Not bad, not bad. You indeed can be taught. It seems like you have not yet lost your wits because of this matter, so I will tell you now beforehand. In reality, even if I don't say it, you will know in 3 to 4 more days, said the little old man faintly, nodding his head in satisfaction. Hearing this, Han Li was slightly startled, but he concentrated his attention on hearing the other person's next utterance. One had to know that he had always been on edge with regards to the matter of Martial Ancestor Li's sudden acceptance of him as a disciple. Thus, he naturally would not pass up an opportunity to get the inside story beforehand. What rewards do you think you can get, having turned in this many spiritual medicines? The little old man suddenly asked, changing the subject. It should be exchangeable for 2 foundation establishment pills. I had asked around earlier. If one turns in around 10 spiritual medicines, one can exchange them for 1 foundation establishment pill. Han Li responded obediently. He knew that the other person would definitely have a reason for asking this kind of a question. HMPH. In a few days, when the rewards are granted, you will only have the portion of 1 foundation establishment pill. You can stop dreaming about getting 2, said the little old man somewhat mockingly. What? How could it be this way? Could there be people who embezzle the rewards? Han Li almost bounced up, an expression of disbelief on his face. There isn't any embezzlement. No one dares to do that. Only your rewards have decreased. All the others should be receiving their entire reward. Otherwise, who would be willing to participate in the next trial by blood and fire? The little old man explained with a slanted mouth. Could the reason be due to Martial Ancestor Li? Han Li asked seriously after tilting his head and thinking for a moment. You can't be considered to be too stupid, since you found the heart of the matter so quickly. It really is because Martial Ancestor Li accepted you as a disciple that it would be this way. The little old man nodded, admiration flashing through his eyes. This sect has an unwritten practice. If there is any clear master-disciple relationship, the master has the right to take half of the disciple's tribute to the sect as a gift to thank the master. Of course, this is limited to the first time and cannot be repeated. The spiritual medicines you harvested in the forbidden area can be considered to be a kind of tribute to the sect. Thus, I reckon that the reason why Martial Ancestor Li so zealously accepted you as a disciple is most likely because he wanted your 10 or so herbs as a gift. The spiritual medicines that are passed on are halved, and so your rewards are naturally also halved. so you should not hope for 2 foundation establishment pills anymore, the little old man explained thoroughly to Han Li. Han Li knitted his eyebrows, but he revealed no traces of anger or dissatisfaction, only lowering his head soundlessly. This caused the little old man to feel somewhat shocked and sense that something was off. He naturally did not know that not only was Han Li not angry, he actually let out a long sigh and relaxed the heart that had always been tight. It turned out that this new master had wanted his spiritual medicines. This had really been outside of his expectations, but it also caused Han Li to begin to relax. To Han Li, who was about to refine these pills, 1 foundation establishment pill could not amount to much. As long as he could succeed in refining these pills, he couldn't care less about the loss of merely 1. The little old man didn't know Han Li's attitude. Seeing that Han Li didn't make a sound, he thought that Han Li was holding in a stomach of stuffiness but was good at controlling it and didn't let it leak out. Thus, he lightly laughed and began to comfort Han Li. Although you get 1 less foundation establishment pill, you exchanged it for being accepted as martial ancestor Li's in-name disciple. You haven't suffered a huge loss, so it's not too bad. One has to know that your talent is not very good. Even if you were to use 2 foundation establishment pills, your hopes of successfully entering the foundation establishment stage are not too high. It's more worth it to use 1 in exchange for gaining martial ancestor Li as an influential backer. This way, even if in the future you are still in the chi condensation stage, pretty much no one in the sect will dare to provoke you. You should know that, although martial ancestor Li was not sincerely accepting you as his disciple, you are still carrying his influence, which regular disciple or steward would give you trouble lightly. In addition, as far as I know, Junior Marshal Uncle Li is very protective of his face. And Han Li heard this, he was somewhat moved in his heart. When the little old man had sent him the 2 bottles of pills before he went to the forbidden area, he could already tell that the other person was someone with a cold exterior but a warm heart. This person's character truly was not bad. But with these words, Han Li remembered them in his heart even more. It seemed as if the other person was worth building a deep relationship with. Although Han Li thought this in his heart, outwardly he still pretended to be barely moved by what the little old man said, and after bitterly laughing a few times, he finally opened his mouth to speak and carelessly spoke with him for a bit. This senior martial Uncle Ma, seeing that Han Li had seemingly recovered from this setback, was very happy in his heart, and not long after he said his goodbyes and left. The 100 Medicine Garden naturally was once again under Han Li's care. Chapter 213 Preparation. Chapter 213 Preparation. Although the journey to the forbidden area had only taken 10 days, Han Li felt as if several years had passed. Thus, he lied down on his bed in the 100 Medicine Garden for a long while, basking in comfort and longing. Not only did he finally return with his life intact from this trip he gambled his life with, he had also perfectly accomplished his goals. Now he could indulge in a truly worry-free and sound sleep. It seemed that all of the struggles from the mortal world were far away from him in a flash as he slept. Han Li slept until the afternoon of the 2nd day before awakening. After Han Li woke up, he quivered with excitement. He immediately started to set up his plans for the future. His first matter of business would naturally be to mature the 3 main medicines as soon as possible and properly preserve them. As for the other auxiliary medicine ingredients, he would naturally leave them for last. However, complete preparation for all of this was not a matter of 10 days or half a month. According to Han Li's estimates, at the very minimum, he would need several years before being completely ready to start refining the pills. As a result, Han Li wasn't in a hurry with his spiritual medicines. Instead, he arranged his harvest from the forbidden area. The result was that he obtained over 10 mid-grade spirit stones, several hundreds of low-grade spirit stones, a large pile of magic tools of all grades, several chunks of the centipede demonic beast's outer shell, several materials from the inky flood dragon, and a bunch of rubbish. However, apart from these items, there were 2 items that Han Li were most interested in: a figurine holding a bow and arrow and a lustrous silver book page. This figurine was mainly carved from wood, with complete ears, nose, mouth, and eyes. It seemed gentle, as if it were alive. Furthermore, it was dressed from head to toe in an extremely realistic metal armor suit with a bronze bow in hand. This was the magic tool that Han Li previously acquired from his elders. It was the high-grade magic tool, Puppet Bowman. After he obtained the magic tool, Han Li did not make use of it. That was because this magic tool required a secret soul-splitting technique. The puppet required a sliver of spiritual sense to enter it in order to control it. This soul-splitting technique was not possible until one reached Foundation establishment. It should be known that only cultivators at Foundation establishment or higher have the sufficient spiritual sense to endure the pain of dividing one's soul. With the mere spiritual sense of a chi condensation cultivator, before even completing the soul splitting, the person would have already fallen into demise and gone mad. It is often said that an immortal's spiritual sense could be used to look in all directions and to scan through items. However, this isn't the true significance of splitting one's soul. Originally, spiritual sense was nothing more than a small external technique. However, after cultivating the secret technique to split one's soul, it would be equivalent to having one, even several separate individual divine senses, with each divine sense capable of controlling several tools. The more times one divided their soul, the more magic tools they could control simultaneously. It should be known that when chi condensation disciples normally confronted an enemy, at most they could use 2 magic tools at the same time. If they used any more, they would no longer be able to control them with ease. After all, who didn't have 5 or 6 magic tools on hand? If they were to throw them all at their opponent, it would definitely be ineffective and would cause the opponent to be baffled for a moment. After Han Li fiddled with the figurine for a good while, he placed it down and took a look at the silver book page. This silver book page was from the spoils Han Li obtained from the barefoot man of the giant sword sect. The top was bumpy, textured with many peculiar decorative designs. It seemed very mysterious. Han Li pondered over it for the majority of the day without even a clue and could only set it aside for the time being. Like that in the following days, Han Li studied the silver book page while waiting for news from the upper echelon. He was seeing whether or not what the old man had said was true, that his reward had been reduced. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Marshal Uncle Wang and an unfamiliar steward went to find Han Li and only brought a single Foundation establishment pill as a reward. What they said was basically the same as what the small old man had said. Marshal Ancestor Li had taken away the spiritual medicines under the pretext of his disciples' filial tribute to his master. After Han Li heard this, he coldly chuckled to himself, but his exterior appearance didn't reveal the slightest complaint. Seeing this, the 2 stewards, who originally believed that they would have to waste time explaining clearly, let out a sigh of relief. Then they left, saying goodbye with beaming smiles. After Han Li saw the pair's departure, he laughed at himself for a moment and put away his newly obtained Foundation establishment pill. Now he could take the time to shut himself away and consume the Foundation establishment pills after he refined them. After all, for each day he couldn't refine medicine pills, Han Li would be unable to peacefully enter seclusion. Like that, month by month passed by. 3 years of time flashed by and Han Li's pill refining preparations were finally completed. Within this rather lengthy period of time, several matters had occurred. After Junior Marshal's sister, Chen, consumed her rewarded Foundation establishment pill, she bitterly cultivated for an entire year. In the end, she succeeded in establishing her foundation and entered Foundation establishment. However, her elder brother's luck wasn't very good. Although it was his second time consuming the Foundation establishment pill, he had failed to make a breakthrough and lingered just outside of Foundation establishment. It was said that this great young master of the Chen clan had lost complete confidence in the immortal path and simply left the sect, returning to his clan to handle affairs. Furthermore, Han Li's reputation in Yellow Maple Valley had gradually risen, and he could now be considered a minor celebrity. With regards to the tale of his great stroke of luck in the Forbidden Area, obtaining a large number of spiritual medicines and becoming the unnamed disciple of Marshal Ancestor Li, it had fluttered about through the sect on the first year of his return, causing other low-level disciples to burn with great envy. But by the second year, this matter had gradually settled down. However, there was still a small incident during this time. That old man who reneged on over half of the agreed items suddenly sent over the rest of the long-overdue items without exception. There was even a bit extra. This caused Han Li to greatly experience firsthand the ease and confidence brought by having a greatly influential backer, and he could not help but be secretly pleased by his position. It seemed that his position of being an unnamed disciple of Marshal Ancestor Li had quite a few truly good benefits. TL, having an influential backer, literally, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter / the shade is plentiful underneath a large tree. However, with regards to paying his respects to his master, Han Li truly had no words to say. Apart from being assigned as an in-name disciple to the man, and receiving a personally transcribed copy of the Azure Essence Sword Arts from him, Han Li did not hear anything else from him in these 3 years. It seemed that he had completely forgotten about Han Li long ago. Apart from a few unspoken complaints, Han Li was quite satisfied with his current situation. He currently was wholeheartedly throwing himself into the first steps of refining the Foundation establishment pills. He naturally did not wish for anyone to disturb him. However, his life of near seclusion had finally come to close. About 3 days ago, Han Li finished maturing the last auxiliary spiritual medicine he required, and thus possessed all his ingredients. All he needed was one last thing. After several days of ordering and packing, Han Li packed his ripened spiritual medicines in a neat order and headed toward Yue Lu Hall. Yue Lu Hall was exactly the same as Han Li had last seen it several years ago. Naturally, those who were guarding the transportation formation had already been replaced with another 2 Foundation establishment disciples. However, the procedure was the same along with the same intolerant gazes, causing Han Li to laugh inwardly. Regardless, he still entered Yue Lu Hall without any trouble. Walking along the signless passage, Han Li saw that ugly man who caused him much unhappiness. He was currently sleeping inside the stone room. Han Li wrinkled his brow. After muttering to himself for a moment, he took out a small bell magic tool. Then he walked up to the ugly man and lightly shook the bell next to his ear. This small bell wasn't much to Han Li's ear, but it caused the ugly man to act as if his buttocks were on fire. He immediately jumped and loudly yelled unclearly, "What's happening? Who is it? Yi, what are you up to?" The ugly man was still clearly half asleep. For the moment, he actually didn't use coarse language toward Han Li. Han Li didn't see this as rude and immediately mentioned his title as an apprentice to his master. "This one is martial ancestor Li Huayuan's disciple and wishes to borrow earth fire for his own use. Will your distinguished self open the door?" Martial ancestor Li. The ugly man had clearly heard of martial ancestor's famous name and immediately jumped. He hurriedly and repeatedly said several praises and turned around, walking to the stone door. After he had just walked 2 steps, he immediately thought of something and then turned around, sizing up Han Li with a doubting gaze. When Han Li saw this, he clearly understood the other man's intention. After a moment of hesitation, he took out the Azure Essence Sword Arts Li Huayuan had delivered to him and presented it to the ugly man. On it was martial ancestor Li's personal signature. He did not think that this ugly man not only knew of martial ancestor Li's name, but also recognized a bit of his handwriting. After he looked at the book for a bit, he respectfully returned it to Han Li. He then said with a smiling face, "I don't know whether this junior martial brother wishes to refine tools or refine pills. I will certainly arrange it for junior martial brother." Han Li was originally relying on martial ancestor Li's name to see whether or not he could get a few special considerations with regards to earth fire. Seeing that the ugly man tactfully took the initiative to say these words, Han Li said with a relaxed expression, "This one plans to refine a few pills and hopes that a room can be arranged with rather mild and stable earth fire. I trouble your esteemed self." Previously, Han Li asked the small old man about the approximate circumstances of the earth fire grounds, and knew that this location was where the rooms for earth fire was arranged for use. Thus he had said those words. "That is easy to do. This one will immediately arrange it for junior martial disciple. However, the service charge," the ugly man replied, seeming embarrassed. When Han Li heard this, he faintly smiled. He unexpectedly took out a mid-grade spirit stone and handed it over to the ugly man, leisurely adding, "This one will naturally pay the amount of spirit stones in accordance to the norm. Because the time to refine these pills will be long, this mid-grade spirit stone can be considered an advanced payment. If it is too much, then I'll take back the difference." Chapter 214 Earth Fire Room. Chapter 214 Earth Fire Room. Good. I will prepare everything for junior martial brother right now." The ugly man, seeing that Han Li had actually given him a mid-grade spirit stone, immediately beamed with joy. One had to know that although the generally accepted exchange rate in the world of cultivators was 100 low-grade spirit stones for 1 mid-grade spirit stone, in reality, those willing to use a mid-grade spirit stone to exchange for 100 low-grade spirit stones were very few in number. This was because everyone knew that under the same circumstances, the speed of absorbing spiritual chi from a mid-grade spirit stone was much faster than when using low-grade spirit stones. Just based on this point, everybody wanted to keep a mid-grade spirit stone, and naturally would not pay much attention to low-grade spirit stones. Of course, the situation when exchanging high-grade spirit stone with mid-grade spirit stones was the same. After the ugly man had happily received this fire attribute spirit stone, he treated Han Li even more obsequiously. He immediately led Han Li before a huge, five-colored stone door and pulled out a purple command medallion from his waist, pointed it at the stone door and shook it. Red light flashed across the purple command medallion and a wisp of rosy light shot from it, precisely hitting the door. This caused the five-colored flowing light to rapidly gyrate. Finally, with a few ear-splitting creaks, the stone door slowly rose, revealing a black tunnel behind it. This tunnel was a few tens of feet high and was square in shape. Junior Marshal brother, the room with earth fire is just past this walled stone path. Let's head over there now, said the ugly man to Han Li ingratiatingly as he squeezed out a few traces of a smile. And Han Li nodded his head without saying anything, then took the lead to walk into the tunnel. Although this dark stone cannot be considered a rare item, it is still not a very common material in this world. To be able to find so much at one time, and then use it as bricks to construct the tunnel and the room, it was only after a few martial ancestors with great ability from previous generations had spent a great deal of effort that it was constructed. Due to dark stone's ability to resist high temperatures and the strange effects of refining using earth fire, no big accidents have occurred yet ever since this earth fire began to burn, said the ugly man, showing off a little as he led the way. Han Li's interest was greatly aroused when he heard this. He couldn't help but touch the black stone wall off to the side and found that it was smooth and ice cold. This dark stone, where is it produced? It can actually resist earth fire, which is 30% more powerful than true fire. It truly is something special. Han Li expressed his approval, a rarity, and casually asked. This, I heard that although it isn't too rare of an item, our state of UA really doesn't produce any of it. These were all obtained by the martial ancestors from a state extremely far to the west. It really was extremely troublesome, explained the ugly man. Just like this, Han Li followed behind the ugly man. In the time it took to roll one's eyes, they had passed the other two similarly large stone doors, finally walking out of the dark stone tunnel. They appeared within an extremely large, round-shaped lobby. This large lobby was similarly constructed of dark stone, but it was 400 or 500 feet in diameter and was taller than 100 feet. It was shockingly enormous. Evenly distributed white stone doors of identical size surrounded the huge lobby, roughly 30 of them in total. There were no traces of other humans in the large lobby, only Han Li and the ugly man, both of whom had just arrived. Han Li, after curiously sizing up the place, heard the ugly man say with a laugh, "Underneath this large lobby is the location where the earth fire gathers and burns the brightest. Thus, the sect opened up a total of 36 earth fire refining rooms here. The best rooms for refining pills are number 18 and number 19. However, number 18 is already occupied by a senior martial uncle, so junior martial brother should use room number 19. Although it is somewhat worse than number 18, the flame intensity and stability are also extremely outstanding," said the ugly man with a grin. As he spoke, he led Han Li in front of a door with 19 painted in gold on its surface. Hearing this, Han Li did not say anything and silently nodded his head, indicating his assent. The ugly man, seeing this, immediately pulled out a jade tablet and stuck it on the door, and the white stone door automatically opened. Then, the ugly man and Han Li entered this room. The room was square. Its surface area was average, only 80 or 90 square feet in size. However, in the heart of the room was a round heap a few feet wide, and a fist-sized gourd was hanging from each of the four walls. A jade green meditation mat was also in a corner not too far away. The round heap was similarly made of dark stone and was extremely flat, only half a foot tall. However, 8 lifelike, fire-red miniature dragon figures were inlaid at the edges of the round heap. In addition, the mouths of the dragons were slightly elevated, aimed at a location in the air above the heart of the round heap, and they assumed a very lifelike spitting position. After clearly seeing the circumstances inside of the room, Han Li felt quite astonished. But before he even opened his mouth to ask, the ugly man had already gotten close to the round heap and took the initiative to explain to Han Li. "Junior martial brother, this is this room's earth fire opening. The earth fire needed to refine pills shoots out from these 8 dragon bodies. In addition, one can adjust the intensity and height of the flames according to one's needs. The exact technique to control it is inscribed on the surface of the stone heap," explained the ugly man, pointing at the round heap. However, he then pointed at the 4 gourds hanging on the walls and said, "Within these gourds is spark sand, which can temporarily add to the intensity of the earth fire. If Junior Marshall Brother feels that the earth fire's temperature is not high enough, you can use these to temporarily increase its intensity, but the duration will not be long. In addition, Junior Marshall Brother should carefully put away this jade tablet. Once the door to the room closes, all contact with the outside world will be cut off. Unless numerous core formation cultivators put their strength together, nobody can enter from the outside, so Junior Marshall Brother can be assured that there will be absolutely no one who will disturb you." Hearing these words, Han Li began to rejoice quietly in his heart. This kind of a completely sealed-off environment was just what he needed, and he couldn't help but reveal a few traces of delight. At this time, seeing that his explanations were good enough, the ugly man said goodbye and took his leave. Han Li, after watching the ugly man walk out of the room, immediately used the jade tablet and caused the stone door to seal shut. Then, he excitedly walked to the round heap, and after circling it many times, began to closely inspect those 8 spitting dragons. In the past few years, Han Li had purposefully spent a huge amount of time researching techniques for refining pills, all for the sake of refining this foundation establishment pill. Thus, he could not be considered a stranger to the Tao of alchemy. He knew that whether or not refining a pill succeeded was related mainly to the control of the fire, as well as opening the furnace to retrieve the pill at the right timing. As for the composition of the ingredients and their quantities, after being put into practice countless times by former generations, they had already been clearly described on the recipe, so one did not have to consider it. Of course, appropriately increasing or decreasing the quantities needed to form a pill once was acceptable. As long as one followed the fixed scale, both increasing or decreasing the quantities of the ingredients was permitted. However, while it was easy to say, actually doing it would be extremely difficult. After accurately controlling the pill furnace's fire, one also had to grasp how to open the furnace at the right time. Who knew how many prospective alchemists these 2 great problems had confounded? Even the current, most well-known masters of alchemy could not help but admit that even if they were to personally attempt it, the success rate of forming a pill would still not be too high, only roughly a 50-50 chance of success, and this was for refining the pills they were the most proficient at. Thus, one did not even have to mention any regular alchemist. The success rate of refining a pill completely depended on whether or not the alchemist's experience was plentiful. The more an alchemist had refined a pill, the higher their odds of successfully refining a pill would be. Thus, both alchemists and talisman masters were neck and neck for the 2 most profitable careers in the cultivating world, and thus they were also the 2 most popular occupations. From his inquiries, he was actually clear about these things, and he knew that based on his novice self, wanting to refine a foundation establishment pill at this moment was purely a dream. Thus, he had already planned out from the start to refine these foundation establishment pills one by one. In this way, no matter how many times he failed, he would not feel too distressed about the loss of spiritual medicines, and the amount of spiritual medicines he had prepared was enough to refine more than 100 pills. He trusted that this many ingredients would be sufficient for him to accumulate enough experience early on. Having made a decision, Han Li committed the method of how to use the dragons to memory. Then, he began to form the appropriate hand seals, and shot out 8 streaks of red light towards the dragons in a row. The dragons immediately absorbed red light, and their mouths opened. A purple flame as thick as a chopstick spurted out from each of their mouths separately. Instantly, the high temperature of the flames began to diffuse throughout the air inside of the room, causing Han Li to be quietly shocked. Then Han Li tried adjusting the thickness of the flame, as well as finely manipulating the height of the flames spurting from the dragons. When he could control them with ease, he extinguished the flames from the dragons. Next, he walked towards the prayer mat and sat down cross-legged, then began to restore his energy. Han Li sat for the greater half of a day. After feeling that his energy and physical strength had reached their optimal condition, he opened his eyes and stood up, preparing to begin refining the pills. Thankfully, Han Li's cultivation technique had luckily passed the 10th layer, allowing him to refrain from eating. Thus, he did not need to eat. Now, Han Li fished out the silver-threaded cauldron that he had bought that day from his storage pouch, then placed a floating technique onto it, causing it to stop in midair directly above the round heap. This magic technique was also one that he had specifically cultivated for today's task, and he had used up many days learning it. Han Li once again shot out red light towards the dragons, stimulating the release of the purple earth fire. Because ingredients had not been placed inside of the cauldron, Han Li controlled the fire and made it extremely thin as a silk thread. Then, he caused the silver-threaded cauldron to begin to rotate in midair under the heating of the 8 flames. After a quarter of an hour, the silver-threaded cauldron was already blisteringly hot and emitted a shockingly high temperature. Seeing this, Han Li pointed at the small cauldron, causing its lid to immediately fly into the air, revealing the opening of the cauldron. He flipped his right hand, and a white jade bottle appeared in it. The bottle contained a precise quantity of fine spiritual medicine powder that he had prepared earlier. Controlling the small bottle, Han Li dumped the medicinal powder inside of the bottle completely into the silver-threaded cauldron. Then, he immediately tossed this bottle and retrieved another bottle from his storage pouch, continuing to repeat the same motion. Like this, Han Li completely dumped all of the 10 spiritual medicine powders that he needed into the silver-threaded cauldron, finally replacing the lid and covering it up again. The first step was finally completed, seemingly in a perfect manner, and no mistakes had occurred. Chapter 215, Refining Pills and Foundation Establishment. Chapter 215, Refining Pills and Foundation Establishment. Under Han Li's manipulation, the purple fire that the 8 dragons spat out became almost as thick as a finger. As the silver-threaded cauldron's rotation speed slowed down, the flame's center started to faintly tremble. As time passed by, the small cauldron released a medicinal fragrance that could stir up a person's spirit. However, Han Li clearly understood that at this moment, he was still very far away from forming a pill. At the very least, he would need to use an even more intense flame and coagulate the pill in an instant. Only in this way would he be able to produce the pill. With this thought, the purple flame under Han Li's control became even more dazzling, becoming even as thick as a bowl, causing the entire silver-threaded cauldron to be enclosed within the flames. From afar, the small cauldron had already become a massive fireball, and the medicinal fragrance became increasingly heavy. Han Li knew without guessing that this was the medicinal powder beginning to coagulate into a pill, and so he became increasingly careful. But right at that moment, a muffled explosion came from the cauldron. Although its sound wasn't loud, it caused Han Li's heart to sink, and his expression was somewhat ugly. After hesitating for a moment, Han Li sighed and stopped the earth fire. Then, with a wave of his hand, he opened the lid of the scalding small cauldron and reached his head out to take a look. Within the cauldron were numerous chunks of light blue solids that had split. It seemed like they were the waste products from the yet-to-coagulate pill. Han Li shook his head and retrieved another jade box, placing it on the ground. Then, he controlled the silver-threaded cauldron and flipped it, dumping these waste pills into the box, then stowed them away. Even if these were waste pills, they were still composed of various spiritual medicinal powders that had yet to coagulate. Han Li could not bear to just throw them away like that. Who knew if in the future he would have any other uses for them? After completing all of this, Han Li went back to sitting on the prayer mat until the silver-threaded cauldron had completely cooled down before starting to refine pills again. He performed the same procedure with the same powder ingredients and the same technique when controlling the flame, but unfortunately, each time he still failed on the coagulation step. This time, Han Li's face had no expression. When his condition had been properly adjusted, he silently began the next cycle. A month's time passed. The ugly man, seeing that Han Li had yet to come out of the earth fire room, felt very shocked. However, he was even more excited, because in this way he could charge even more fees. After 2 months, stone door number 18 still did not open. Apart from the elation in his heart, the ugly man also felt great astonishment. 3 months. After 6 months, Han Li still showed absolutely no indication of coming out. Now, the ugly man's joy had long since disappeared completely, leaving behind only an expression full of anxiety and a stomach that felt unsettled. Nearly half a year's time, with regards to pill or weapon refining, was not actually a very rare occurrence. The ugly man had seen even longer periods of seclusion numerous times. But the people who had spent that much time in the earth fire room were all at the very least disciples above the foundation establishment stage. It was truly his first time seeing a chi condensation disciple like Han Li spend so long inside their refining pills. In addition, chi condensation disciples could only hold out at most a month without eating. Could this disciple of martial ancestor Li have brought in food and drink with him, allowing him to persevere for so long? The ugly man thought with a doubtful expression. Inside of the earth fire room, Han Li sat cross-legged on the prayer mat. looking at the 20 or so vividly blue Foundation establishment pills floating in front of him, an expression of deep thought on his face. These pills were all the rewards that Han Li had received from spending countless amounts of his blood, sweat, and tears during this past half-year. Obtaining them was truly difficult beyond comparison, and Li had been unable to pass even the coagulation step for the first 20 or so refinements. Looking at each of the waste pills, his heart felt very pained. He had almost given up, deciding that after he had returned and learned the proper alchemy techniques from other alchemists, he would start refining Foundation establishment pills again. Although the amount of time he would waste would be incredibly long, it would be better than for him to vainly squander his spiritual medicines. However, before he was about to leave, he decided, perhaps by a stroke of divine inspiration, to open the cauldron and make another refinement. And this time, as if by the aid of the gods, the pill actually coagulated. In addition, when he opened the furnace to retrieve the pill, he was miraculously able to successfully retrieve it on his first try. Thus, he obtained his first Foundation establishment pill that he had created by his own hands. This Foundation establishment pill, apart from being slightly smaller, was exactly the same as the other 3 medicinal pills that he already had. This caused Han Li's spirit to be greatly stirred up. With this time's encouragement, Han Li gritted his teeth and dispelled the idea of returning. He calmed his heart and continued. Following this time's experience of success, Han Li's success rate in coagulating the pill immediately began to increase like crazy. Within 3 refinements, he successfully coagulated the pill once. As for opening the furnace, Han Li had extraordinary innate skill. He successfully retrieved more than half of the medicinal pills from the furnace on his first try. This was something that Han Li had never expected could happen. During this period of time, when Han Li felt extremely hungry and thirsty, he would take out the bottle of fasting pills that he had received from the little old man and eat one. Then, he would be able to persevere for another month. He had obtained this bottle of fasting pills by exchanging them for a few hundred-year-old herbal medicines. Today, they just so happened to come in handy. Like this, when the raw materials Han Li possessed were almost completely used up, he had obtained this batch with a frightening amount of Foundation establishment pills. The number of medicinal pills in this batch greatly surpassed his initial expectations. Early on, when he had heard about the great difficulties of refining pills, he reckoned that it could be considered pretty good if he were to even obtain 7 or 8 of them. But today it seemed that it was not as excessively difficult to refine as he had heard from the cultivating world. Could those alchemists be misguiding other cultivators? Or was it that he truly had an innate talent for refining pills? Han Li felt perplexed. In reality, Han Li had thought too far to the left. The technique for refining pills was actually even more difficult than was spread around in the outside world. It would be impossible for one to groom an alchemist with average talent without 20 to 30 years of time and a nearly astronomical amount of money. And the Han Li of today, with respect to his skill in refining Foundation establishment pills, could already be considered part of the upper echelon when compared with other average alchemists. The reason why such an inconceivable phenomenon could occur was completely due to Han Li's nearly half a year of refining the same pill. One had to know that even the most rich and imposing sects would have no way of having an adequate supply of precious ingredients to allow an alchemist to refine the same pill for half of a year's time. This kind of thing was somewhat possible if one were to consider the lowest grade medicinal pills. However, if it were low-grade medicinal pills, what need was there for one to purposefully refine and accumulate experience? In any case, the ingredients were cheap, and if it was not refined successfully, one could just start again. Han Li did not understand this, and so naturally he did not figure it out. However, after briefly mulling over it, he let it go. This was because he had suddenly had the idea of immediately swallowing the Foundation establishment pill and attempt to break through the Foundation establishment bottleneck. This thought was extremely strong, causing Han Li to consider very seriously the possibility of undergoing closed-door cultivation in this earth fire room. After 11 months, the stone door to the earth fire room that Han Li was in remained tightly shut with no sign of opening. On this day, the ugly man was numbly gazing at the 19th stone door with an anxious expression. He was certain that something had definitely occurred to Han Li inside. Otherwise, even Foundation establishment cultivators should have already come out. He was not actually worried for Han Li as a person. Rather, he was seriously afraid that martial ancestor Li would, after discovering his disciple's mishap, would take out his anger on him. In addition, although he was a close relative of sect leader Zhang, which was the reason why he could watch over this area, The ugly man was very clear that if martial ancestor Li really became angry over this, his supporter would definitely not get him out of this predicament. Just as the ugly man's stomach was filled with anxiety, the stone door in front of him suddenly flashed with a white light, then it opened soundlessly. Next, a person walked out, flushed with success. This was Han Li, who had been inside of the room for close to a year. The ugly man reacted after a long time and was instantly both surprised and happy. He hurriedly took a few steps forward with a mouthful of complaints. "Junior Marshal brother, why have you only come out now? If you hadn't come out, I would've. You." The ugly man had just spoken a few sentences when his eyes suddenly became round, as if he had seen a ghost. He pointed at Han Li, his mouth open and his tongue tied. He was unable to say anything. "What, is there something wrong with me?" Han Li asked with a slight smile, glancing at the light that suddenly flashed across the person's face. Your cultivation. Am I? Could ... could you be in the foundation establishment stage?" The ugly man regained his focus after a long time and asked while stammering with a confused and alarmed expression. "Yes. After I refined the pill, I felt that the environment here wasn't bad, so I swallowed a foundation establishment pill and underwent closed-door cultivation. In the end, I successfully broke through the bottleneck. Now, I truly am a foundation establishment cultivator." Upon hearing the other person ask in this way, Han Li declared proudly while stretching lazily. "Reach foundation establishment here." The ugly man glanced at the earth fire room behind Han Li, then glanced at Han Li, still unable to believe it. Undergoing foundation establishment inside of an earth fire room specifically for refining pills, this was truly his first time hearing of anything like this. However, after moving his lips a few times, he did not voice the questions that he had. Not only was the other person martial ancestor Li's disciple, simply based on his identity as a foundation establishment cultivator, he was already not someone that a chi condensation disciple like him could afford to provoke. "What, is it not allowed?" Han Li casually glanced at the other person and asked impolitely. He immediately emitted the pressure that only foundation establishment cultivators could release. This caused the ugly man, who was very close to him, to instantly be forced many steps backwards, and he began to sweat profusely. "Of course it isn't. There are no such nonsensical rules from above. Congratulations to Martial Uncle on his great success during his seclusion." The ugly man was actually very clever, immediately nodding his head and bending over at the waist, saying this while laughing with him. Even his previous way of addressing Han Li as Junior Martial Brother was immediately changed to Martial Uncle. Since the other person had successfully reached the foundation establishment stage today, he could be considered the ugly man's elder. To be somewhat more deferential was a necessity. The ugly man was able to adopt a very light-hearted perspective. He understood very thoroughly what the appropriate behavior should be towards those with greater power in the cultivating world.